Chapter 1 of King Richard I. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Wilson. King Richard I by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 1. King Richard's mother. King Richard I, the Crusader, was a boisterous, reckless and desperate man, and he made a great deal of noise in the world in his day. He began his career very early in life by quarrelling with his father. Indeed, his father, his mother, and all his brothers and sisters were engaged, as long as the father lived, in perpetual wars against each other, which were waged with the most desperate fierceness on all sides. The subject of these quarrels was the different possessions which the various branches of the family held or claimed in France and in England, each endeavouring to dispossess the others. In order to understand the nature of these difficulties, and also to comprehend fully what sort of a woman Richard's mother was, we must first pay a little attention to the map of the countries over which these royal personages held sway. We have already seen in another volume of this series how the two countries of Normandy on the continent and of England became united under one government. England, however, did not conquer and hold Normandy. It was Normandy that conquered and held England. The relative situation of these two countries is shown on the map. Normandy, it will be seen, was situated in the northern part of France, being separated from England by the English Channel. Besides Normandy, the sovereigns of the country held various other possessions in France, and this French portion of the compound realm over which they reigned they considered as far the most important portion. England was but a sort of appendage to their empire. You will see by the map the situation of the river Loire. It rises in the centre of France and flows to the westward, through a country which was even in those days very fertile and beautiful. South of the Loire was a sort of kingdom then under the dominion of a young and beautiful princess named Eleonora. The name of her kingdom was Aquitaine. This lady afterward became the mother of Richard. She was very celebrated in her day, and has since been greatly renowned in history under the name of Eleonora of Aquitaine. Eleonora received her realm from her grandfather. Her father had gone on a crusade with his brother Eleonora's uncle, Raymond, and had been killed in the east. Raymond had made himself master of Antioch. We shall presently hear of this Raymond again. The grandfather abdicated in Eleonora's favour when she was about 14 years of age. There were two other powerful sovereigns in France at the time: Louis, King of France, who reigned in Paris, and Henry, Duke of Normandy and King of England. King Louis of France had a son, Prince Louis, who was heir to the crown. Eleonora's grandfather formed the scheme of marrying her to Prince Louis, and thus unite his kingdom to hers. He himself was tired of ruling, and wished to resign his power, with a view to spending the rest of his days in penitence and prayer. He had been a wicked man in his day, and now, as he was growing old, he was harassed by remorse for his sins, and wished, if possible, to make some atonement for them by his penances before he died. So he called all his barons together and laid his plans before them. They consented to them on two conditions. The first was that Eleonora should first see Louis and say whether she was willing to have him for a husband. If not, she was not to be compelled to marry him. The other condition was that their country, Aquitaine, was not to be combined with the dominions of the King of France after the marriage, but was to continue a separate and independent realm, to be governed by Louis and Eleonora, not as King and Queen of France, but as Duke and Duchess of Aquitaine. Both these conditions were complied with. The interview was arranged between Louis and Eleanora concluded that she should like the king for a husband very much. The interview was arranged between Louis and Eleanora concluded that she should like the king for a husband very much. At least she said so, and the marriage was concluded. Indeed, the match thus arranged for Eleanora was in all worldly respects the most eligible one that could be made. Her husband was the heir apparent to the throne of France. His capital was Paris, which was then as now the great centre in Europe of all splendour and gaiety. The father of Louis was old, and not likely to live long. Indeed, he died very soon after the marriage, and thus Eleanora, when scarcely 15, became Queen of France as well as Duchess of Aquitaine, and was finally raised to the highest pinnacle of worldly grandeur. She was young and beautiful and very gay in her disposition, and she entered at once upon a life of pleasure. She had been well educated. She could sing the songs of the troubadours, which was the most fashionable music of those days, in a most charming manner. Indeed, she composed music herself, and wrote lines to accompany it. She was quite celebrated for her learning, on account of her being able to both read and write. These were rare accomplishments for ladies in those days. She spent a considerable portion of her time in Paris at the court of her husband, but then she often returned to Aquitaine, where she held a sort of court of her own in Bordeaux, which was her capital. She led this sort of life for some time, until at length she was induced to form a design of going to the East on a crusade. The Crusades were a military expedition which went from the western countries of Europe to conquer Palestine from the Turks, in order to recover possession of Jerusalem and of the sepulchre where the body of Christ was laid. It had been for some time the practice for the princes and knights and other potentates of France and England to go on these expeditions on account of the fame and glory which those who distinguished themselves acquired. The people were excited, moreover, to join the Crusades by the preaching of the monks and hermits who harangued them in public places and urged them to go. At these assemblages, the monks held up their symbols of the crucifixion to inspire their zeal, and promised them the special favour of heaven if they would go. They said that whoever devoted himself to this great cause should surely be pardoned for all the sins and crimes that he had committed, whatever they might be. And whenever they heard of the commission of any great crimes by potentates or rulers, they would seize upon the occasion to urge the guilty persons to go and fight for the cross in Palestine, as a means of wiping away their guilt. One of these preachers charged such a crime upon Louis, the husband of Eleanora. It seems that in a quarrel which he had had with one of his neighbours, he had sent an armed force to invade his enemy's dominions, and in storming a town, a cathedral had been set on fire and burned, and 1,500 people who had taken refuge in it as a sanctuary had perished in the flames. Now it was a very great crime, according to the ideas of those times, to violate a sanctuary, and the hermit preacher urged Louis to go on a crusade in order to atone for the dreadful guilt he had incurred by not only violating a sanctuary, but by overwhelmingly, in doing it, so many hundreds of innocent women and children in the awful suffering of being burnt to death. So Louis determined to go on a crusade, and Eleanora determined to accompany him. Her motive was a love of adventure and a fondness for notoriety. She thought that by going out, a young and beautiful princess at the head of an army of crusaders into the East, she would make herself a renowned heroine in the eyes of the whole world. So she immediately commenced her preparations, and by the commanding influence which she exerted over the ladies of the court, she soon inspired them all with her romantic ardour. The ladies at once laid aside their feminine dress and clothed themselves like Amazons, so that they could ride astride on horseback like men. All their talk was of arms and armour, and horses and camps. They endeavoured, too, to interest all the men, the princes, and the barons and knights that surrounded them, in their plans, and to induce them to join the expedition. A great many did so, but there were some that shook their heads and seemed inclined to stay at home. They knew that so wild and heedless a plan as this could end in nothing but disaster. The ladies ridiculed these men for their cowardice and want of spirit, and they sent them their distaffs as presents. "We have no longer any use for the distaffs," said they, "but as you are intending to stay at home and make women of yourselves, we send them to you, so that you may occupy yourselves with spinning." By such taunts and ridicule as this, a great many were shamed into joining the expedition, whose good sense made them extremely averse to have anything to do with it. The expedition was at length organised and prepared to set forth. It was encumbered by the immense quantity of baggage which the Queen and her party insisted on taking. It is true that they had assumed the dress of Amazons, but this was only for the camp and the field. They expected to enjoy a great many pleasures while they were gone, to give and receive a great many entertainments, and to live in luxury and splendour in the great cities of the East. So they must needs take with them large quantities of baggage, containing dresses and stores of female paraphernalia of all kinds. The king remonstrated against this folly, but all to no purpose. The ladies thought it very hard if, in going on such an expedition, they could not take with them the usual little comforts and conveniences appropriate to their sex. So it ended with them having their own way. The caprices and the freaks of these women continued to harass and interfere with the expedition during the whole course of it. The army of Crusaders reached at length a place near Antioch in Asia Minor, where they encountered the Saracens. Antioch was then in the possession of the Christians. It was under the command of Prince Raymond, who has already been spoken of as Eleanora's uncle. Raymond was a young and very handsome prince, and Eleanora anticipated great pleasure in visiting his capital. The expedition had not, however, yet reached it, but were advancing through the country, defending themselves as well as they could against the troops of the Arab horsemen that were harassing their march. The commanders were greatly perplexed in this emergency to know what to do with the women and with their immense train of baggage. The king at last sent them on in advance, with all his best troops to accompany them. He directed them to go on and encamp for the night on a certain high ground, which he designated, where they would be safe, he said, from an attack by the Arabs. But when they approached the place, Eleanora found a green and fertile valley near, which was very romantic and beautiful, and she decided at once that this was a much prettier place to encamp than the bare hill above. The officers in command of the troop remonstrated in vain. Eleanor and the ladies insisted on encamping in the valley. The consequences was that the Arabs came and got possession of the hill, and thus put themselves between the division of the army which was with Eleanora and that which was advancing under the king. A great battle was fought. The French were defeated. A great many thousand men were slain. All the provisions for the army were cut off, and all the ladies' baggage was seized and plundered by the Arabs. The remainder of the army, with the king and the queen and the ladies, succeeded in making their escape to Antioch, and there Prince Raymond opened the gates and let them in. As soon as Eleanora and the other ladies recovered a little from their fright and fatigue, they began to lead very gay lives in Antioch, and before long a serious quarrel broke out between Louis and the Queen. The cause of this quarrel was Raymond. He was a young and handsome man, and he soon began to show such fondness for Eleanor that the king's jealousy was aroused, and at length the king discerned, as he said, proofs of such degree of intimacy between them as to fill him with rage. He determined to leave Antioch immediately and take Eleanor with him. She was unwilling to go, but the king was so angry that he compelled her to accompany him. So he went away abruptly, scarcely bidding Raymond goodbye at all, and proceeded with Eleanor and nearly all his company to Jerusalem. Eleanor submitted, though she was exceedingly out of humour. The king, too, on his part, was as much out of humour as the queen. He determined that he would not allow her to accompany him any more on the campaign, so he left her at Jerusalem, a sort of prisoner, while he put himself at the head of his army and went forth to prosecute the war. By and by, when he came back to Jerusalem and inquired about his wife's conduct while he had been gone, he learned some facts in respect to the intimacy which she had formed with a prince of the country during his absence that made him more angry than ever. He declared that he would sue for divorce. She was a wicked woman, he said, and he would repudiate her. One of his ministers, however, contrived to appease him, at least so far as to induce him to abandon this design. The minister did not pretend to say that Eleanor was innocent, or that she did not deserve to be repudiated, but he said that if the divorce was to be carried into effect, then Louis would lose all claim to Eleanor's possession, for it will be recollected that the dukedom of Aquitaine, and the other rich possessions which belonged to Eleanor before her marriage, continued entirely separate from the kingdom of France, and still belonged to her. The king and Eleanor had a daughter named Margaret, who was now a young child, but who, when she grew up, would inherit both her father's and her mother's possessions, and thus in the end they would be united, if the king and queen continued to live together in peace. But this would be all lost, as the minister maintained in his argument with the king in case of a divorce. If you are divorced from her, he said, she will soon be married again, and then all her possessions will finally go out of your family. So the king concluded to submit to the shame of his wife's dishonour, and still keep her as his wife. But he had now lost all interest in the crusade, partly on account of his want of success in it, and partly on account of his domestic troubles. So he left the Holy Land, and took the Queen and the ladies and the remnants of his troops back again to Paris. Here he and the Queen lived very unhappily together for about 2 years. At the end of this time the Queen became involved in new difficulties in consequence of her intrigues. The time had passed away so rapidly that it was now 13 years since her marriage, and she was about 28 years of age, old enough, one would think, to have learned some discretion. After, however, amusing herself with various lovers, she at length became enamoured of a young prince named Henry Plantagenet, who afterward became Henry II of England, and was the father of Richard, the hero of this history. Henry was at this time Duke of Normandy. He came to visit the court of Louis in Paris, and here, after a short time, Eleanor conceived the idea of being divorced from Louis in order to marry him. Henry was a great deal younger than Eleanor, being then only about 18 years of age, but he was very agreeable in his person and manners, and Queen Eleanor was quite charmed with him. It was not, however, to be expected that he should be so much charmed for her. Although she had been very beautiful, she had now so far passed the period of her youth, and had been subjected to so many exposures that the bloom of her early beauty was in a great measure gone. She was now nearly 30 years old, having been married 12 or 13 years. She, however, made eager advances to Henry, and finally gave him to understand that if he would consent to marry her, she would obtain a divorce from King Louis, and then endow him with all her dominions. Now there was a strong reason operating upon Henry's mind to accept this proposal. He claimed to be entitled to the crown of England. King Stephen was at this time reigning in England, but Henry maintained that he was an usurper, and he was eager to dispossess him. Eleanor represented to Henry that, with all the forces of her dominions, she could easily enable him to do that, and so at length the idea of making himself a king overcame his natural repugnance to take a wife almost twice as old as him and she too the divorced and discarded wife of another man. And so he agreed to take Eleanor's proposal, and measures were soon taken to effect the divorce. There is some dispute amongst the ancient historians in respect to this divorce. Some say that it was the king that originated it, and that the cause which he alleged was the freedom of the queen in her love for other men, and that Eleanor, when she found that the divorce was resolved upon, formed the plan of beguiling Henry into marriage with her, to save her fall. Others say that the divorce was her plan alone, and that the pretext for it was the relationship that existed between her and King Louis, for they were in some degree related to each other, and the rules of the Church of Rome were very strict against such marriages. It's not improbable, however, that the real reason of the divorce was that the king desired it on account of his wife's loose and irregular character, while Eleanor wished for it in order to have a more agreeable husband. She never had liked Louis. He was a very grave and even gloomy man, who thought of nothing but the church and his penances and prayers, so that Eleanor said he was more of a monk than a king. This monkish turn of mind had increased upon the king since his return from the Crusades. He made it a matter of conscience to wear coarse and plain clothes instead of dressing handsomely like a king, and he cut off the curls of his hair, which had been very beautiful, and shaved his head and moustache. This procedure disgusted Eleanor completely. She despised her husband herself and ridiculed him to others, saying that he had made himself look like an old priest. In a word, all her love for him was entirely gone, both parties being thus very willing to have the marriage annulled. They agreed to put it on the ground of their relationship, in order to avoid a scandal. At any rate, the marriage was dissolved, and Eleanor set out from Paris to return to Bordeaux, the capital of her own country. Henry was to meet her on the way. Her road lay along the banks of the Loire. Here she stopped for a day or two. The count who ruled this province, who was a very gay and handsome man, offered his hand. He wished to add her dominions to his own. Eleanor refused him. The count resolved not to take the refusal, and under some pretext or other he detained her in his castle, resolving to keep her there until she should consent. But Eleanor was not a woman to be conquered by such a method as this. She pretended to acquiesce in the detention, and to be contented, but this was only to put the count off his guard, and then, watching her opportunity, she escaped from the castle in the night, and getting into a boat which she had caused to be provided for the purpose, she went down the river to the town of Tours, which was some distance below, and in the dominions of another sovereign. In going on from Tours towards her own home, she encountered and narrowly escaped another danger. It seems that Geoffrey Plantagenet, the brother of Henry, whom she had engaged to marry, conceived the design of seizing her and compelling her to marry him instead of his brother. It may seem strange that anyone should be so unprincipled and base as to attempt thus to circumvent his own brother and take away from him his intended wife. But it was not a strange thing at all for the members of royal and princely families of those days to act in this manner towards each other. It was the usual and established condition of things among these families that the different members of them should be perpetually intriguing and manoeuvring one against the other, brother against sister, husband against wife, and father against son. In a vast number of instances, these contentions broke out into open war, and the wars thus waged between the nearest relatives were of the most desperate and merciless character. It was therefore a very moderate and inconsiderable deed of brotherly hostility on the part of Geoffrey to plan the seizure of his brother's intended wife, in order to get possession of her dominions. The plan which he formed was to lie in wait for the boat, which was to convey Eleanor down the river, and seize her as she came by. She, however, avoided this snare by turning off into a branch of the river which came from the south. You will see the course of the river and the situation of this southern branch on the map. The branch which Eleanor followed not only took her away from the ambush which Geoffrey had laid for her, but conducted her towards her own home, where, after meeting with various other adventures, she arrived safely at last. Here Henry Plantagenet soon joined her, and they were married. The marriage took place only 6 weeks after her divorce from her former husband. This was considered a very scandalous transaction throughout, and Eleanor was now considered as having forfeited all claims to respectability of character. Still, she was a great duchess in her own right, and was now wife of the heir apparent of the English throne, and so her character made little difference in the estimation in which she was held by the world. From the time of her first engagement with Henry, nearly 2 years had elapsed before all the proceedings in relation to the divorce had been completed so as to prepare the way for the marriage, and now Eleanor was about 32 years of age, while Henry was only 20. Henry seems to have felt no love for his wife. He had acceded to a proposal to marry him only in order to obtain assistance which the forces of her dominions might supply him in gaining possession of the English throne. Accordingly, about a year after the marriage, a military expedition was fitted out to proceed to England. The expedition consisted of 36 ships and a large force of fighting men. Henry landed in England at the head of this force, and advanced against Stephen. The two princes fought for some time without any very decisive success on either side, when at length they concluded to settle the quarrel by a compromise. It was agreed that Stephen should continue to hold the crown as long as he lived, and then that Henry should succeed him. When this arrangement had been made, Henry returned to Normandy, and then, after 2 or 3 years, he heard of Stephen's death. He then went immediately to England again, and was universally acknowledged as king. Eleanor went with him as queen, and very soon they were crowned at Westminster with the greatest possible pomp and parade. And thus it was that Eleanor of Aquitaine, the mother of Richard, in the year 1154 became Queen Consort of England. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of King Richard I. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. King Richard I by Jacob Abbott, Chapter 2. Richard's early life. Almost all the early years of the life of our hero were spent in wars which were waged by the different members of his father's family against each other. These wars originated in the quarrels that arose between the sons and their father in respect to the family property and power. Henry had 5 sons, of whom Richard was the third. He also had 3 daughters. The king held a great variety of possessions, having inherited from his father and grandfather, or received through his wife, a number of distinct and independent realms. Thus he was Duke of one country, Earl of another, King of a third, and Count of a fourth. England was his kingdom, Normandy was his great dukedom, and he held besides various other realms. He was a generous father, and he began early by conveying some of these provinces to his sons. But they were not contented with the portions that he voluntarily assigned them. They called for more. Sometimes the father yielded to these unreasonable demands, but yielding only made the young men more grasping than before, and at length the father would resist. Then came the rebellions, and the leagues formed by the sons against the father, and the mustering of armies and battles and sieges. The mother generally took part with the sons in these unnatural contests, and in the course of them the most revolting spectacles were presented to the eyes of the world, of towns belonging to a father sacked and burned by the sons, or castles beleaguered and the garrisons reduced to famine, in which a husband was defending himself against the forces of his wife, or a sister against those of a brother. Richard himself, who seemed to have been the most desperate and reckless of the family, began to take an active part in these rebellions against his father when he was only 17 years old. These wars continued with various temporary interruptions, for many years, and whenever at any time a brief peace was made between the sons and the father, then the young men would usually fall into quarrelling amongst themselves. Indeed, Henry, the oldest of them, said that the only possible bond of peace between the brothers seemed to be a common war against their father. Nor did the king live on much better terms with his wife than he did with his children. At the time of Eleanor's marriage with Henry, her prospects were bright indeed. People of England, notwithstanding the evil reports that were spread in respect to her character, received her as their queen with much enthusiasm, and on the occasion of her coronation they made a great deal of parade to celebrate the event. Her appearance at that time attracted unusual attention. This was partly on account of her personal attractions, and partly on account of her dress. The style of her dress was quite oriental. She had brought home with her from Antioch a great many Eastern fashions, and many elegant articles of dress, such as mantles of silk, and brocade, scarfs, jewelled girdles and bands, and beautiful veils, such as are worn at the East. These dresses were made at Constantinople, and when displayed by the Queen in London, they received a great deal of admiration. We can see precisely how the Queen looked in these dresses by means of illuminated portraits of her contained in the books written at that time. It was the custom in those days in writing books, the work of which was all executed by hand, to embellish them with what were called illuminations. These were small paintings inserted here and there upon the page, representing the distinguished personages named in the writing. These portraits were painted in very brilliant colours, and there are several still remaining that show precisely how Eleanora appeared in one of her oriental dresses. She wears a close headdress, with a circlet of gems over it. There is a gown made with tight sleeves, and fastened with the full gathers, just below the throat, where it is confined by a rich collar of gems. Over this is an elegant outer robe, bordered with fur. The sleeves of the outer robe are very full and loose, and are lined with ermine. They open so as to show the close sleeves beneath. Over all is a long and beautiful gauze veil. The dress of the king was very rich and gorgeous too, and so indeed was that of all the ecclesiastics and other dignitaries that took part in the celebration. All London was filled with festivity and rejoicing on the occasion, and the Queen's heart overflowed with pride and joy. After the coronation, the king conducted Eleanora to a beautiful country residence called Bermondsey, which was a short distance from London, toward the south. Here there was a palace and gardens and beautiful grounds. The palace was on an elevation which commanded a fine view of the capital. Here the Queen lived in royal state. She had, however, other palaces beside, and she often went to and fro among her different residences. She contrived a great many entertainments to amuse her, such as comedies, games, revels, and celebrations of all sorts. The king joined with her in these schemes of pleasure. One of the historians of the time gives a curious account of the appearance of the king and the court in their excursions. When the king sets out of a morning, you see multitudes of people running up and down as if they were distracted, horses rushing against horses, carriages overturning carriages, players, gamesters, cooks, confectioners, Maurice dancers, barbers, courtesans, and parasites, making so much noise and, in a word, such an intolerable tumultuous jumble of horse and foot, that you can imagine the great abyss hath opened, and poured forth all its inhabitants. It was about 3 years after Eleanor was crowned Queen of England that Richard was born. At the time of his birth, the Queen was residing at the palace in Oxford. The palace had gone pretty much to ruin. The building is now used in part as a workhouse. The room where Richard was born is roofless and uninhabitable. Nothing even of the interior of it remains, except some traces of the fireplace. The room, however, though thus completely gone to ruin, is a place of considerable interest to the English people, who visit it in great numbers, in order that they may see the place where the great hero was born. For desperate and reckless as Richard's character was, the people of England are quite proud of him on account of his undaunted bravery. It is very curious that the first important event of Richard's childhood was his marriage. He was married when he was about 4 years old. That is, he was regularly and formally affianced, and a ceremony which might be called the marriage ceremony was duly performed. His bride was a young child of Louis, King of France. The child was about 3 years old. Her name was Alice. This marriage was the result of a sort of bargain between Henry, Richard's father, and Louis, the French king. They had had a fierce dispute about the portion of another of Louis's children that had been married in the same way to one of Richard's brothers, named Henry. The English king complained that the dowry was not sufficient, and the French king, after a long discussion, agreed to make it up by giving another province with his daughter Alice to Richard. The reason that induced the King of England to effect these marriages was that the provinces that were bestowed with their infant wives as their dowries came into his hands as the guardian of their husbands while they were minors, and thus extended, as it were, his own dominions. By this time the realms of King Henry had become very extensive. He inherited Normandy, you recollect, from his ancestors, and he was in possession of that country before he became King of England. When he was married to Eleanora, he acquired through her a large addition to his territory by becoming jointly with her the sovereign of her realms in the south of France. Then, when he became King of England, his power was still more extended, and finally, by the marriages of his sons, the young princes, he received other provinces besides, though, of course, he held these last only as the guardian of his children. Now, in governing these various realms, the king was accustomed to leave his wife and his sons in different portions of them, to rule them in his absence, though still under his command. They each maintained a sort of court in the city, where their father left them, but they were expected to govern the several portions of the country in strict subjection to their father's general control. The boys, however, as they grew older, became more and more independent in feeling, and the Queen, being a great deal older than her husband, and having been, before her marriage, a sovereign in her own right, was disposed to be very little submissive to his authority. It was under these circumstances that the family quarrels arose that led to the wars spoken of at the beginning of the chapter. Richard himself, as was there stated, began to raise rebellions against his father when he was about 17 years old. Whenever in the course of these wars the young men found themselves worsted in their contests with their father's troops, their resource was to fly to Paris in order to get King Louis to aid them. This Louis was always willing to do, for he took great pleasure in the dissensions which were thus continually breaking out in Henry's family. Beside these wars, King Eleanora had one great and bitter source of trouble in a guilty attachment which her husband cherished for a more beautiful lady, more nearly his own age than his wife was. Her name was Rosamond. She is known in history as Fair Rosamond. A full account of her will be given in the next chapter. All that is necessary to state here is that Queen Eleanora was made very wretched by her husband's love for Rosamond, though she scarcely had any right to complain, for she had, as it would seem, done all in her power to alienate the affections of her husband from herself by the levity of her conduct, and by her bold and independent behaviour in all respects. At last, at one time, while she was at Bordeaux, the capital of her realm in Aquitaine, she heard rumours that the king was intending to obtain a divorce from her, in order that he might openly marry Rosamond, and she was determined to go back to her former husband, Louis of France. The country, however, was full of castles which were garrisoned by Henry's troops, and she was afraid that they would prevent her going if they knew of her intention. So she contrived a plan of disguising herself in man's clothes, and undertook to make her escape in that way. She succeeded in getting away from Bordeaux, but her flight was soon discovered, and the officers of the garrison immediately set off a party to pursue her. The pursuers overtook her before she had gone far and brought her back. They treated her quite roughly, and kept her prisoner in Bordeaux until her husband came. When Henry arrived, he was quite angry with the Queen for having thus undertaken to go back to her former husband, whom he considered as his greatest rival and enemy, and he determined that she should have no opportunity to make another such attempt. So he kept a very strict watch over her, and subjected her to so much restraint that she considered herself a prisoner. The king had a quarrel also at this time with one of his daughters-in-law, and he made her a prisoner too. Soon after this he went back to England, taking these two captives in his train. In a short time he sent the Queen to a certain palace which he had in Winchester, and there he kept her confined for 16 years. It was during this period of their mother's captivity that the wars between the father and his sons waged most fiercely. At length, in the year 1182, in the midst of one of the most violent wars that had raged between the king and his sons, a message came to the king that his son Henry was very dangerously sick, and that he wished his father to come and see him. The king was greatly at a loss what to do on receiving this communication. His counsellors advised him not to go. It was only a stratagem, they said, on the part of the young prince to get his father into his camp and so take him prisoner. So the king concluded not to go. He had, however, some misgivings that his son might be really sick, and accordingly dispatched an archbishop to him with a ring which he said he sent to him as a token of his forgiveness and of his paternal affection. Very soon, however, a second messenger came to the king to say that Prince Henry had died. These sad tidings overwhelmed the heart of the king with the most poignant grief. He at once forgot all the undutiful and disobedient conduct of his son, and remembered him only as his dearly beloved child. He became almost broken-hearted. The prince himself on his deathbed was borne down with remorse and anguish in thinking of the crimes that he had committed against his father. He longed to have his father come and see him before he died. The ring which the archbishop was sent to bring to him arrived just in time, and the prince pressed it to his lips and blessed it with tears of frantic grief. As the hour of death approached, his remorse became dreadful. All the attempts made by the priests around his bed to soothe and quiet him were unavailing, and at last his agony became so great that he compelled them to put a rope around him and drag him from his bed to a heap of ashes placed for the purpose in his room, that he might die there. A heap of ashes, he said, was the only fit place for such a reprobate as he had been. So will it be with all undutiful children, when on their deathbeds they reflect on their disobedient and rebellious conduct toward the father and the mother to whom they owe their being. It is remarkable how great an effect a death in a family produces in reconciling those who before had been at enmity with each other. There are many husbands and wives who greatly disagree with each other in times of health and prosperity, but who are reconciled and made to love each other by adversity and sorrow. Such was the effect produced upon the minds of Henry and Eleanora by the death of their son and heir. They were both overwhelmed with grief, for the affection which a parent bears to a child is never wholly extinguished, however undutiful and rebellious a child may be, and the grief which the two parents now felt in common brought them to a reconciliation. The king seemed disposed to forgive the Queen for the offences, whether real or imaginary, which she had committed against him. "Now that our dear son is dead and gone," he said, "let us no longer quarrel with each other." So he liberated the Queen from the restraint which he had imposed upon her, and restored her once more to her rank as an English Queen. This state of things continued for about a year, and then the old spirit of animosity and contention burned up once more, as fiercely as ever. The king shut up Eleanor again, and a violent quarrel broke out between the king and his son Richard. The cause of this quarrel was connected with the Princess Alice, to whom, it will be recollected, Richard had been betrothed in his infancy. Richard claimed now, since he was of age, his wife ought to be given to him, but his father kept her away, and would not allow the marriage to be consummated. The king made various excuses and pretexts for the delay. Some thought that the real reason was that he wished to continue his guardianship and his possession of the dower as long as possible. But Richard thought his father was in love with Alice himself, and that he did not intend that he, Richard, should have her at all. This difficulty led to new quarrels, in which the king and Richard became more exasperated with each other than ever. This state of things continued until Richard was 34 years old, and his bride was 30. Richard was so far bound to her that he could not marry any other lady, and his father obstinately persisted in preventing his completing the marriage with her. In the meantime, Prince Geoffrey, another of the king's sons, came to a miserable end. He was killed in a tournament. He was riding furiously in the tournament in the midst of a great number of other horsemen, when he was unfortunately thrown from his steed and trodden to death on the ground by the hoofs of the other horses that were galloped over him. The only two sons that were left now were Richard and John. Of these, Richard was the oldest, and he was, of course, his father's heir. King Henry, however, formed a plan for dividing his dominions between his two sons, instead of allowing Richard to inherit the whole. John was his youngest son, and, as such, the king loved him tenderly. So he conceived the idea of leaving to Richard all his possessions in France, which constituted the most important part of his dominions, and of bestowing the kingdom of England upon John, and in order to make sure of the carrying of this arrangement into effect, he proposed crowning John King of England forthwith. Richard, however, determined to resist this plan. The former King of France, Louis VII, was now dead, and his son, Philip II, the brother of Alice, reigned in his stead. Richard immediately set off for Paris and laid his case before the young French king. "I am engaged," he said, "to your sister Alice, and my father will not give her to me. Help me to maintain my rights and hers." Philip, like his father, was always ready to do anything in his power to foment dissension in the family of Henry. So he readily took Richard's part in the new quarrel, and he, somehow or other, contrived means to induce John to come and join in the rebellion. King Henry was overwhelmed with grief when he learned that John, his youngest and now dearest child, and the last that remained, had abandoned him. His grief was mingled with resentment and rage. He invoked the bitterest curses on his children's heads, and he caused a device to be painted for John and sent to him, representing a young eaglet picking out the parent's eagle's eyes. This was to typify him his own undutiful and unnatural behaviour. Thus the domestic life which Richard led while he was a young man was embittered by the continual quarrels between the father, the mother, and the children. The greatest source of sorrow to his mother, however, was the connection which subsisted between the king and the Lady Rosamond. The nature and the results of this connection will be explained in the next chapter. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of King Richard I. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. King Richard I by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 3 Fair Rosamond. During his lifetime, King Henry did everything in his power, of course, to keep the circumstances of his connection with Rosamond a profound secret, and to mislead people as much as possible in regard to her. After his death, too, it was for the interest of his family that as little as possible should be known respecting her, Thus it happened that, in the absence of all authentic information, a great many strange rumours and legends were put in circulation, and at length, when the history of those times came to be written, it was impossible to separate the false from the true. The truth, however, so far as it can now be ascertained, seems to be something like this. Rosamond was the daughter of an English nobleman named Clifford. Lord Clifford lived in a fine old castle situated in the valley of the Wye, in a most romantic and beautiful situation. The River Wye is in the western part of England. It flows out from among the mountains of Wales through a wild and romantic gorge, which, after passing the English frontier, expands into a broad and fertile and most beautiful valley. The castle of Lord Clifford was built at the opening of the gorge, and it commanded an enchanting view of the valley below. It was here that Rosamond spent her childhood, and here probably that Henry first met her while he was yet a young man. She was extremely beautiful, and Henry fell very deeply in love with her. This was while they were both very young, and some time before Henry thought of Eleanora for his wife. There is some reason to believe that Henry was really married to Rosamond, though if so, the marriage was a private one, and the existence of it was kept a profound secret from all the world. The real and public marriages of kings and princes are almost always determined by reasons of state, and when Henry at last went to Paris and saw Eleanora there, and found moreover that she was willing to marry him, and to bring him as her dowry all her possessions in France, which would so greatly extend his dominions, he determined to accede to her desires, and to keep his connection with Rosamond, whatever the nature of it might have been, a profound secret forever. So he married Eleanora, and brought her to England, and lived with her, as has already been described, in the various palaces which belonged to him, sometimes in one and sometimes in another. Among these palaces one of the most beautiful was that of Woodstock. The engravings on the opposite page represents the buildings of the palace as they appeared some hundreds of years later than the time when Rosamond lived. In the days of Henry and Rosamond, the palace of Woodstock was surrounded with very extensive and beautiful gardens and grounds. Somewhere upon these grounds the story was that Henry kept Rosamond in a concealed cottage. The entrance to the cottage was hidden in the depths of an almost impenetrable thicket, and could only be approached through a tortuous and intricate path which led this way and that by an infinite number of turns, forming a sort of maze made purposely to bewilder those attempting to pass in and out. Such a place was often made in those days in palace grounds as a sort of ornament, or rather as an amusing contrivance to interest the guests coming to visit the proprietor. It was called a labyrinth. A great many plans of labyrinths have been found delineated in ancient books. The paths were not only so arranged as to twist and turn in every imaginable direction, but at every turn there were several branches made so precisely alike that there was nothing to distinguish one from the other. Of course, one of these roads was the right one, and led to the centre of the labyrinth, where there was a house, or a pretty seat with a view, or a garden, or a shady bower, or some other object of attraction, to reward those who should succeed in getting in. The other paths led nowhere, or rather, they led on through various devious windings, in all respects similar to those of the true path, until at length they came to a sudden stop, and the explorer was obliged to return. The paths were separated from each other by dense hedges of thorn, or by high walls, so that it was impossible to pass from one to another except by walking regularly along. It was in a house entered through such a labyrinth as this that Rosamond is said to have lived, on the grounds of the palace of Woodstock, while Eleanora, as the avowed wife and queen of King Henry, occupied the palace itself. Of course, the fact that such a lady was hidden on the grounds was kept a profound secret from the Queen. If this story is true, there were probably other labyrinths on the grounds, and this one was so surrounded with trees and hedges which connected it by insensible gradations with the groves and the thickets of the park, that there was nothing to attract attention to it particularly, and thus a lady might have remained concealed in it for some time without awakening suspicion. At any rate, Rosamond did remain, it is supposed for a year or two, concealed thus, until at length the Queen discovered the secret. The story is that the King found his way in and out of the labyrinth by means of a clue of floss silk, and that the Queen one day, when riding with the King in the park, observed this clue, a part of which had in some way or other become attached to his spur. She said nothing, but, watching a private opportunity, she followed the clue. It led by a very intricate path into the heart of the labyrinth. There the Queen found a curiously contrived door. The door was almost wholly concealed from view, but the Queen discovered it and opened it. She found that it led into a subterranean passage. The interest and curiosity of the Queen were now excited more than ever, and she determined that the mystery should be solved. So she followed the passage, and was finally led by it to a place beyond the wall of the grounds, where there was a house in a very secluded spot surrounded by thickets. Here the Queen found Rosamond sitting in a bower and engaged in embroidering. She was now in a great rage, both against Rosamond and against her husband. It was generally said that she poisoned Rosamond. The story was that she took a cup of poison with her and a dagger, and, presenting them both to Rosamond, compelled her to choose between them, and that Rosamond chose the poison, and, drinking it, died. This story, however, was not true, for it is now known that Rosamond lived many years after this time, though she was separated from the King. It is thought that her connection with the King continued for about 2 years after his marriage with Eleanora. She then left him. It may be that she did not know before that time that the King was married. She may have supposed that she was herself his lawful wife, as indeed it's possible that she may have actually been so. At any rate, soon after she and Eleanora became acquainted with each other's existence, Rosamond retired to a convent, and lived there in complete seclusion all the rest of her days. The name of this convent was Godstow. It was situated near Oxford. Rosamond became a great favourite with the nuns while she remained at the convent, which was nearly 20 years. During this time the King made many donations to the convent for Rosamond's sake, and the jealousy of the Queen against her beautiful rival, of course, continued unabated. It was indeed this difficulty in respect to Rosamond that was one of the chief causes of the domestic trouble which always existed between Henry and the Queen. The world at large have always been most disposed to sympathise with Rosamond in this quarrel. She was nearly of the King's own age, and his attachment to her arose, doubtless, from sincere affection, whereas the Queen was greatly his senior, and had inveigled him into a marriage with her through motives of the most calculating and mercenary character. Then, moreover, Rosamond either was, or was supposed to be, a lady of great gentleness and loveliness of spirit. She was very kind to the poor, and while in the convent she was very assiduously devoted to her religious duties. Eleanora, on the other hand, was a very unprincipled and heartless woman, and she had been so loose and free in her own manner of living too, as everybody said and believed, that it was with a very ill grace that she could find any fault with her husband. Thus, under the circumstances of the case, the world has always been most inclined to sympathise with Rosamond rather than with the Queen. The question which we ought to sympathise with depends upon which was really the wife of Henry. He may have been truly married to Rosamond, or at least some ceremony may have been performed which she honestly considered as marriage. If so, she was innocent, and Henry was guilty of having virtually repudiated this marriage in order to connect himself with Eleanora for the sake of her kingdom. On the other hand, if she were not married to Henry, but used her arts to entice him away from his true wife, then she was deeply in fault. It's very difficult now to ascertain which of these suppositions is the correct one. In either case, Henry himself was guilty, toward the one or the other, of treacherously violating his marriage vows, the most solemn vows, in some respects, that a man can ever assume. Rosamond had 2 children, named William and Geoffrey, and at one time in the course of his life, Henry seemed to acknowledge that they were his only 2 children, thus admitting the validity of his marriage with Rosamond. This admission was contained in an expression which he used in addressing William on a field of battle when he came toward him at the head of his troop. "William," he said, "you are my true and legitimate son. The rest are nobodies." He may, it is true, have only intended to speak figuratively in saying this, meaning that William was the only one worthy to be considered as his son, or it may be that it was an inadvertent and hasty acknowledgment that Rosamond, and not Eleanor, was his true wife. As time rolled on, however, and the political arrangements arising out of the marriage with Eleanora, and the appointment of her sons to high positions in the state became more and more extended, the difficulties which the invalidation of the marriage with Eleanora would produce became very great, and immense interests were involved in sustaining it. Rosamond's rights, therefore, if she had any, were wholly overborne, and she was allowed to linger and die in her nunnery as a private person. When at length she died, the nuns who had become greatly attached to her caused her to be interred in an honourable manner in the chapel, but afterwards the bishop of the diocese ordered the remains to be removed. He considered Rosamond as having never been married to the king, and he said that she was not a proper person to be the subject of monumental honours in the chapel of a society of nuns. So he sent the remains away and ordered them to be interred in the common burying ground. If Rosamond was what he supposed her to be, and if he removed the remains in a proper and respectful manner, he was right in doing what he did. His motive may have been, however, merely a desire to please the authorities of his time, who represented, of course, the heirs of Eleanora, by sealing the stamp of condemnation on the character and position of her rival. But though the authorities may have been pleased with the bishop's procedure, the nuns were not at all satisfied. They not only felt a strong personal affection for Rosamond, but as a sisterhood they felt grateful to her memory on account of the many benefactions which the convent had received from Henry on account of her residence there. So they seized the first opportunity to take up the remains again, which consisted now of dry bones alone, and, after perfuming them and enclosing them again in a new coffin, they deposited them once more under the pavement of the chapel, and laid a slab with a suitable inscription over the spot to mark the place of the grave. The house where Rosamond was concealed at Woodstock was regarded afterwards with great interest, and there was a chamber in it that was for a long time known as Rosamond's chamber. There remains a letter of one of the kings of England, written about 100 years after this time, in which the king gives directions to have this house repaired, and particularly to have the chamber restored to a perfect condition. His orders are that the house beyond the gate in the new wall be built again, and that the same chamber, called Rosamond's chamber, be restored as before, and crystal plates, that is, glass for the windows, and marble and lead be provided for it. From that day to this, the story of Rosamond has been regarded as one of the most interesting incidents of English history. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of King Richard I. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. King Richard I by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 4. The Accession of Richard to the Throne. Richard was called to the throne when he was about 32 years of age, by the sudden and unexpected death of his father. The death of his father took place under the most mournful circumstances imaginable. In the war which Richard and Philip, King of France, had waged against him, he had been unsuccessful. He had been defeated in the battles and outgeneralled in the manoeuvres, and his barons, one after another, had abandoned him and taken part with the rebels. King Henry was an extremely passionate man, and the success of his enemies against him filled him with rage. This rage was rendered all the more violent by the thought that it was through the unnatural ingratitude of his own son, Richard, that all these calamities came upon him. In the anguish of his despair, he cursed the day of his birth, and uttered dreadful maledictions against his children. At length he was reduced to such an extremity that he was obliged to submit to negotiations for peace, on just such terms as his enemies thought fit to impose. They made very hard conditions. The first attempt at negotiating the peace was made in an open field, where Philip and Henry met for the purpose, on horseback, attended by their retainers. Richard had the grace to keep away from this meeting, so as not to be an actual witness of the humiliation of his father, and so Philip and Henry were to conduct the conference by themselves. The meeting was interrupted by a thunderstorm. At first the kings did not intend to pay any heed to the storm, but to go on with their discussions without regarding it. Henry was a very great horseman, and spent almost his whole life in riding. One of his historians says that he never sat down except upon a saddle, unless it was when he was taking his meals. At any rate, he was almost always on horseback. He hunted on horseback, he fought on horseback, and he travelled on horseback, and now he was holding a conference with his enemies on horseback, in the midst of a storm of lightning and rain. But his health had now become impaired, and his nerves, though they had always seemed to be of iron, were beginning to give way under the dreadful shocks to which they had been exposed, so that he was now far less able to endure such exposures than he had been. At length a clap of thunder broke rattling immediately over his head, and the bolts seemed to descend directly between him and Philip as they sat upon their horses in the field. Henry reeled in the saddle, and would have fallen if his attendants had not seized and held him. They found that he was too weak and ill to remain any longer on the spot, and so they bore him away to his quarters, and then Philip and Richard sent him in writing the conditions which they were going to exact from him. The conditions were very humiliating indeed. They stripped him of a great portion of his possessions, and required him to hold others in subordination to Philip and to Richard. Finally, the last of the conditions was that he was to give Richard the kiss of peace, and to banish from his heart all sentiments of animosity and anger against him. Among other articles of the treaty was one binding him to pardon all the barons and other chief men who had gone over to Richard's side in the rebellion. As they read the articles over to the king, while he was lying upon his sick-bed, he asked, when they came to this one, to see the list of names, that he might know who they were that had thus forsaken him. The name at the head of the list was that of his son John, his darling son John, to defend whose rights against the aggressions of Richard had been one of his chief motives in carrying on the war. The wretched father, on seeing this name, started up from his bed and gazed wildly around. "Is it possible," he cried out, "that John, the child of my heart, he whom I have cherished more than all the rest, and for the love of whom I have drawn down on my own head all these troubles, has verily betrayed me?" They told him that it was even so. "Then," he said, falling back helplessly on his bed, "then let everything go as it will. I care no longer for myself, or for anything else in this world. All this took place in Normandy, for it was in Normandy that had been the chief scene of the war between the king and his son. At some little distance from the place where the king was now lying sick, there was a beautiful rural palace at a place called Chinon, which was situated very pleasantly on the banks of a small branch of the Loire. This palace was one of the principal summer resorts of the Dukes of Normandy, and the king caused him now to be carried there in order to seek repose. But instead of being cheered by the beautiful scenes that were around him at Chinon, or reinvigorated by the comforts and the attentions which he could there enjoy, he gradually sank into hopeless melancholy, and in a few days he began to feel that he was about to die. As he grew worse, his mind became more and more excited, and his attendants from time to time heard him moaning in his anguish, "Oh, shame, shame! I am a conquered king, a conquered king! Cursed be the day on which I was born, and cursed be the children that I leave behind me." The priests at his bedside endeavoured to remonstrate with him against these imprecations. They told him that it was a dreadful thing for a father to curse his own children, and they urged him to retract what he had said. But he declared that he would not. He persisted in cursing all his children except Godfrey Clifford, the son of Rosamond, whom was then at his bedside, and who had never forsaken him. The king grew continually more and more excited and disordered in mind, until at length he sank into a raving delirium, and in that state he died. A dead king is a very helpless and insignificant object, whatever may have been the terror which he inspired while he was alive. As long as Henry continued to breathe, the attendants around him paid him great deference, and observed every possible form of obsequious respect, for they did not know but that he might recover to live and reign, and lord it over them and their fortunes for 15 or 20 years to come. But as soon as the breath was out of his body, all was over. Richard his son was now king, and from Henry nothing whatever was any longer to be hoped or feared. So the mercenary and the heartless courtiers, the ministers, priests, bishops, and barons, began at once to strip the body of all the valuables which the king had worn, and also to seize and appropriate everything in the apartments of the palace which they could take away. These things were their perquisites, they said, it being customary, as they alleged, that the personal effects of a deceased king should be divided among those who were his attendants when he died. Having secured this plunder, these people disappeared, and it was with the utmost difficulty that assistance enough could be procured to wrap the body in a winding sheet, and to bring a hearse and horses to bear it away to the abbey where it was to be interred. Examples like this, of which the history of every monarchy is full, throw a great deal of light upon what is called the principle of loyalty in the hearts of those who attend upon kings. While the procession was on the way to the abbey where the body was to be buried, it was met by Richard, who, having heard of his father's death, came to join in the funeral solemnities. Richard followed the train until they arrived at the abbey. It was Abbey Fontenoy, the ancient burial place of the Norman princes. Arrived at the abbey, the body was laid out upon the bier, and the face was uncovered, in order that Richard might once more look upon his father's features. But the countenance was so distorted, with the scowling expression of rage and resentment which it had worn during the sufferer's last hours, that Richard turned away in horror from the dreadful spectacle. But Richard soon drove away from his mind the painful thoughts which the sight of his father's face must have awakened, and turned his attention at once to the business which now pressed upon him. He, of course, was heir both to the crown of England and also to all his father's possessions in Normandy, and he felt that he must act promptly in order to secure his rights. It is true that there was nobody to dispute his claim, unless it was his brother John, for the two sons of Rosamond, Geoffrey and William Clifford, did not pretend to any rights of inheritance. Richard had some fears of John, and he thought it necessary to take decisive measures to guard against any plots that John might be disposed to form. He sent at once to England, and ordered that his mother should be released from her imprisonment, and invested her with power to act as regent there until he should come. In the meantime, he himself remained in Normandy, and devoted himself to arranging and regulating the affairs of his French possessions. This was the wisest course for him to pursue, for there was no one in England to dispute his claim to that kingdom. On the continent the case was different. His neighbour, Philip, King of France, was ready to take advantage of any opportunity to get possession of such provinces on the continent as might be within his reach. It was certainly a good deed in Richard to liberate his mother from her captivity, and to exalt her as he did to a position of responsibility and honour. Eleanora fulfilled the trust which he reposed in her in a very faithful and successful manner. The long period of confinement and suffering which she had endured seemed to have exerted a very favourable influence upon her mind. Indeed, it is very often the case that sorrow and trouble have this effect. A life of prosperity and pleasure makes us heartless, selfish, and unfeeling, while sorrow softens the heart and disposes us to compassionate the woes of others, and to do what we can to relieve them. Eleanora was Queen Regent in England for 2 months, and during that time she employed her power in a very beneficent manner. She released many unhappy prisoners, and pardoned many persons who had been convicted of political crimes. The truth is that probably as she found herself drawing towards the close of life, and looked back upon her past career, and remembered her many crimes, her unfaithfulness to both her husbands, and especially her unnatural conduct in instigating her sons to rebel against their father, her heart was filled with remorse, and she found some relief from her anguish in these tardy efforts to relieve suffering which might, in some small degree, repair the evils that she had brought upon the land by the insurrections and wars which she had been the cause. She bitterly repented of the hostility that she had shown towards her husband, and of the countless wrongs that she had inflicted upon him. While he was alive, and she was engaged in her contest with him, the excitement that she was under blinded her mind, but now that he was dead, her passion subsided, and she mourned for him with bitter grief. She distributed alms in a very abundant manner to the poor to induce them to pray for the repose of his soul. While doing these things, she did not neglect the affairs of state. She made all the necessary arrangements for the immediate administration of government, and she sent word to all the barons and also to the bishops and other great public functionaries, informing them that Richard was coming to assume the government of the realm, and summoning them to assemble and make ready to receive him. In about 2 months Richard came. Before Richard arrived in England, however, he had formed the plan in connection with Philip, the King of France, of going on a crusade. Richard was a wild and desperate man, and he had loved fighting for its own sake, and inasmuch as now, since his father was dead, and his claim to the crown of England and to all his possessions in Normandy was undisputed, there seemed to be nobody for him to fight at home. He conceived the design of organising a grand expedition to go to the Holy Land and fight the Saracens. John was very much pleased with this idea. "If Richard goes to Palestine," he said to himself, 10 to 1 he'll get killed, and then I shall be King of England. So John was ready to do everything in his power to favour the plan of the crusade. He pretended to be very submissive and obedient to his brother, and to acknowledge his sovereign power as king. He aided the king as much as he could in making his arrangements and in concocting all his plans. The first thing was to provide funds. A great deal of money was required for these expeditions. Ships were to be bought and equipped for the purpose of transporting the troops to the east. Arms and ammunition were to be provided, and the large supplies of food. Then the princes and the barons and knights who would accompany the expeditions required very expensive armour and costly trappings and equipments of all sorts. For though the pretence was that they were going out to fight for the recovery of the Holy Sepulchre under the influence of religious zeal, the real motive which animated them was the love of glory and display. Thus it happened that the expense which a sovereign incurred in fitting out a crusade was enormous. Accordingly, Richard, immediately on his arrival in England, proceeded at once to Winchester, where his father, King Henry, had kept his treasures. Richard found a large sum of money there in gold and silver coin, and beside this there were stores of plate, of jewellery, and of precious gems of great value. Richard caused all the money to be counted in his presence, and an exact inventory to be made of all the treasures. He then placed the whole under the charge of trusty officers of his own, whom he appointed to take care of them. The next thing that Richard did was to discard and dismiss all his own former friends and adherents, the men who had taken part with him in his rebellions against his father. Men that would join me in rebelling against my father, he thought to himself, would join anybody else if they thought they could gain by it in rebelling against me. So he concluded that they were not to be trusted. Indeed now, in the altered circumstances in which he was placed, he could see the guilt of rebellion and treason, though he had been blind to it before, and he actually persecuted and punished some of those who had been his confederates in his former crimes. A great many cases analogous to this have occurred in English history. Sons have often made themselves the centre and soul of all the opposition in the realm against their father's government, and having given their fathers a great deal of trouble by so doing. But then in all such cases, the moment that the father dies, the son immediately places himself at the head of the regularly constituted authorities of the realm, and abandons all his old companions and friends, treating them sometimes with great severity. His eyes are opened to the wickedness of making opposition to the sovereign power, now that the sovereign power is vested in himself, and he disgraces and punishes his former friends for the crime of having aided him in his undutiful behaviour. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of King Richard I. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. King Richard I by Jacob Abbott, Chapter 5. The Coronation. It was now time that the coronation should take place, and arrangements were accordingly made for performing this ceremony with great magnificence in Westminster Abbey. The day of the ceremony acquired a dreadful celebrity in history in consequence of a great massacre of the Jews, which resulted from an insurrection and riot that broke out in Westminster and London immediately after the crowning of the king. The Jews had been hated and abhorred by all the Christian nations of Europe for many ages. Since they were not believers in Christianity, they were considered as little better than infidels and heathen, and the government that oppressed and persecuted them the most was considered as doing the greatest service to the cause of religion. One very curious result followed from the legal disabilities that the Jews were under. They could not own land, and they were restricted also very much in respect to nearly all avocations open to other men. They consequently learned gradually to become dealers in money and in jewels, this being almost the only reputable calling that was left open to them. There was another great advantage too for them in dealing in property of this kind, and that was that comprising, as such property does, great value in small bulk, it could easily be concealed and removed from place to place whenever it was especially endangered by the edicts of governments or the hostility of enemies. From these and similar reasons, the Jews became the bankers and moneylenders, and they are this day the richest bankers and greatest moneylenders in the world. The most powerful emperors and kings often depend upon them for the supplies that they require to carry on their great undertakings, or to defray the expenses of their wars. The Jews had gradually increased in numbers and influence in France, until the time of the accession of Philip, and then he determined to extirpate them from the realm. So he issued an edict by which they were all banished from the kingdom. Their property was confiscated, and every person that owed them money was released from all obligation to pay them. Of course, a great many of their debtors would pay them, notwithstanding this relief, from the influence of that natural sense of justice which, in all nations and in all ages, has a very great control in human hearts. Still, there were others who would of course avail themselves of this opportunity to defraud their creditors of what was justly their due, and being obliged to, at the same time, to fly precipitously from the country in consequence of the decree of the banishment. The poor Jews were reduced to a state of extreme distress. Now the Jews of England, when Henry died and Richard succeeded him, began to be afraid that the new king would follow Philip's example, and in order to prevent this, and to conciliate Richard's favour, they determined to send a delegation to him at Westminster at the time of his coronation, with rich presents which had been procured by contributions made by the wealthy. Accordingly, on the day of the coronation, when the great crowds of people assembled at Westminster to honour the occasions, these Jews came among them. The ceremony of the coronation was performed in the following manner. The king, in entering the church and proceeding up towards the high altar, walked upon a rich cloth laid down for him, which had been dyed with the famous Tyrian purple. Over his head was a beautifully wrought canopy of silk, supported by 4 long lances. These lances were borne by 4 great barons of the realm. A great nobleman, the Earl of Albemarle, bore the crown, and walked with it before the king as he advanced towards the altar. When the Earl reached the altar, he placed the crown upon it. The Archbishop of Canterbury stood before the altar to receive the king as he approached, and then administered the usual oath to him. The oath was in 3 parts. 1. That all the days of his life he would bear peace, honour, and reverence to God and the Holy Church, and to all the ordinances thereof. 2. That he would exercise right, justice, and law on the people unto him committed. 3. That he would abrogate wicked laws and perverse customs, if any such should be brought into his kingdom, and that he should enact good laws, and the same in good faith keep, without mental reservation. Having taken this oath, the king removed his upper garment, and put golden sandals upon his feet, and then was anointed by the Archbishop with the holy oil on his head, breast, and shoulders. The oil was poured from a rich vessel called an ampulla. The anointing having been performed, the king received various articles of royal dress and decoration from the hands of the great nobles around him, who officiated as servitors on the occasion, and with their assistance put them on. When thus robed and adorned, he advanced up the steps of the altar. As he went up, the Archbishop adjured him in the name of the living God not to assume the crown unless he was fully resolved to keep the oaths that he had sworn. Richard again solemnly called God to witness that he would faithfully keep them, and then advancing to the altar, he took the crown and put it into the hands of the Archbishop, who then placed it upon his head, and thus the coronation ceremony was completed. The people who had presents for the king now approached and offered them to him. Among them came the Jews. Their presents were very rich and valuable, and the king received them very gladly, although in announcing the arrangements for the ceremony he had declared that no Jew and no woman was to be allowed to be present. Notwithstanding this prohibition, the Jewish deputation had come in and offered their presents among the rest. There was, however, a great murmuring among the crowd in respect to them, and a great desire to drive them out. This crowd consisted chiefly, of course, of barons, earls, knights, and other great dignitaries of the realm, for very few of the lower ranks would be admitted to see the ceremony, and these people, in addition to the usual religious prejudice against the Jews, had many of them been exasperated against the bankers and moneylenders on account of the difficulties that they had had with them in relation to money that they had borrowed, and to the high interest which they had been compelled to pay. Some wise observer of the working of human passions has said that men always hate more or less those to whom they owe money. This is a reason why there should ordinarily be very few pecuniary transactions between friends. At length, as one of the Jews who was outside was attempting to go in, a bystander at the gate cried out, "Here comes a Jew!" and struck at him. This excited the passions of the rest, and they struck and pushed the poor Jew in order to drive him back. And at the same time a general outcry against the Jews arose, and spread into the interior of the hall. The people there, glad of the opportunity afforded them by the excitement, began to assault the Jews and drive them out. And as they came out the door, beaten and bruised, a rumour was raised that they had been expelled by the king's order. This rumour, as it spread through the streets, was soon changed into a report that the king had ordered all the unbelievers to be destroyed. And so, whenever a Jew was found in the street, a riot was raised about him, he was assaulted with sticks and stones, cruelly beaten, and if he was not killed, he was driven to seek refuge in his home, wounded and bleeding. In the meantime, the news that the king had ordered all Jews to be killed spread rapidly over the town, and in the evening crowds collected, and after murdering all the Jews that they could find in the streets, they gathered round their houses and finally broke into them and killed the inhabitants. In some cases, where the houses were strong, the Jews barricaded the doors, and the mob could not get in. In such cases they brought combustibles and piled them up before the windows and the doors, and then setting them on fire they burned the house to the ground, and men, women, and children were consumed together in the flames. If any of the unhappy wretches burning in these fires attempted to escape by leaping from the windows, the mob below held up spears and lances for them to fall upon. There were so many of these fires in the course of the night that the whole sky was illuminated, and at one time there was danger that the flames would spread so as to produce a general conflagration. Indeed, as the night passed on, the excitement became more and more violent, until at length the streets, in all the quarters where Jews resided, were filled with the shouts of the mob, raving in demoniacal frenzy, and with the screams of the terrified and dying sufferers, and the crackling of the lurid flames in which they were burning. The king, in the meantime, was carousing with his lords and barons in the great banqueting hall at Westminster, and for a time took no notice of these disturbances. He seemed to consider them as of very little moment. At length, however, in the course of the night, he sent an officer and a few men to suppress the riot. But it was too late. The mob paid no heed to the remonstrances which came from the leader of so small a force, but, on the other hand, threatened to kill the soldiers too, if they did not go away. So the officer returned to the king, and the riot went on undisturbed until about 2 o'clock of the next day, when it gradually ceased from the mere weariness and exhaustion of the people. A few of the men who had been engaged in this riot were afterward brought to trial, and 3 were hung, not for murdering Jews, but for burning some Christian houses which, either by mistake or accident, took fire in the confusion, and were burned with the rest. This was all that was ever done to punish this dreadful crime. In justice to King Richard, however, it must be stated that he issued an edict after this, forbidding that the Jews should be injured or maltreated any more. He took the whole people, he said, thenceforth, under his special protection, and all men were strictly forbidden to harm them personally, or to molest them in the possession of their property. And this was the terrible coronation scene which signalized the investiture of Richard with the crown and the royal robes of England. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of King Richard I. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. King Richard I by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 6. Preparations for the Crusade. At the time of his accession to the throne, Richard, as has already been remarked, was about 32 years of age. On the following page you have a portrait of him with the crown upon his head. This portrait is taken from a sculpture on his tomb, and is undoubtedly a good representation of him as he appeared when he was alive. The first thing that Richard turned his attention to, when he found himself securely seated on his throne, was the preparation for a crusade. It had been the height of his ambition for a long time to lead a crusade. It was undoubtedly through the influence of his mother and of her early conversations with him that he imbibed his extraordinary eagerness to seek adventures in the Holy Land. She had been a crusader herself during her first marriage, as has already been related in this volume, and she had undoubtedly in Richard's early life entertained him with 1,000 stories of what she had seen, and of the romantic adventures which she had met with there. These stories, and the various conversations which arose out of them, kindled Richard's youthful imagination with ardent desires to go and distinguish himself on the same field. These desires had been greatly increased as Richard grew up to manhood by observing the exalted military glory to which successful crusaders attained. And then, beside this, Richard was endued with a sort of reckless and lion-like courage, which led him to look upon danger as a sport, and made him long for a field where there were plenty of enemies to fight, and enemies so abhorred by the whole Christian world that he could indulge in the excitement of hatred and rage against them without any restraint whatever. He could there satiate himself too with the luxury of killing men without any misgiving of conscience, or at least without any condemnation on the part of his fellow-men, for it was understood throughout Christendom that the crimes committed against the Saracens in the Holy Land were committed in the name of Christ. What a strange delusion! To think of honouring the memory of the meek and lowly Jesus by utterly disregarding his peaceful precepts and his loving and gentle example, and going forth in thousands to the work of murder, rapine, and devastation, in order to get possession of his tomb. In preparing for the crusade, the first and most important thing to be attended to in Richard's view was the raising of money. A great deal of money would be required, as has already been intimated, to fit out the expedition on the magnificent scale which Richard intended. There was a fleet of ships to be built and equipped, and stores of provisions to be put on board. There were armies to be levied and paid, and immense expenses were to be incurred in the manufacture of arms and ammunition. The armour and the arms used in those days, especially those worn by knights and noblemen, and the caparisons of the horses, were extremely costly. The armour was fashioned with great labour and skill out of plates or rings of steel, and the helmets and the bucklers and the swords and all the military trappings of the horses and the horsemen, being fashioned altogether by hand, required great labour and skill in the artisan who made them. And then, moreover, it was customary to decorate them very profusely with embroidery and gold and gems. At the present day, men display their wealth in the costliness of their houses, and the gorgeousness and luxury of the furniture which they contain. It is not considered in good taste, except for ladies, to make a display of wealth upon the person. In those days, however, the reverse was the case. The knights and barons lived in the rudest stone castles, dark and frowning without, and meagrely furnished and comfortless within, while all the means of display which the owners possessed were lavished in arming and decorating themselves and their horses magnificently for the field of battle. For all these things Richard knew that he should require a large sum of money, and he proceeded at once to carry into effect the most wasteful and reckless measures for obtaining it. His father, Henry II, had in various ways acquired a great many estates in different parts of the kingdom, which estates he had added to the royal domains. These Richard at once proceeded to sell to whomsoever would give the most for them. In this manner he disposed of a great number of castles, fortresses, and towns, so as greatly to diminish the value of the crown property. The purchasers of this property, if they had not money enough of their own to pay for what they bought, would borrow from the Jews. Some of the king's counsellors remonstrated with him against this wasteful policy, but he replied that he needed the money so much for the crusade that, if necessary, he would sell the city of London itself to raise it, if he could only find a man rich enough to be the purchaser. After having raised as much money as he could by the sale of the royal lands, the next resource to which Richard turned was the sale of public offices and titles of honour. He looked about the country for wealthy men, and he offered them severally high office, on condition of their paying large sums of money into the treasury as a consideration for them. He sold titles of nobility too in the same way. If any man who was not rich held a high or important office, he would find some pretext for removing him, and then would offer the office for sale. One of the historians of those times says that at this period Richard's presence chamber became a regular place of trade, like the counting room of a merchant or an exchange, where everything that could be derived from the bounty of the crown or bestowed by the royal prerogative was offered for sale in open market to the man who would give the best bargain for it. Another of the modes which the king adopted for raising money, and in some respects the worst of all, was to impose fines as a punishment for crime, and then, in order to make the fines produce as much as possible, every imaginable pretext was resorted to charge wealthy persons with offences, with a view of exacting large sums from them as the penalty. It was said that a great officer of state was charged with some offence, and was put in prison, and not released until he had paid a fine of £3,000. One of the worst of these cases was that of his half-brother, Geoffrey, the son of Rosamond. Geoffrey had been appointed Archbishop of York in accordance with the wish that his father Henry had expressed on his deathbed. Richard pretended to be displeased with this. Perhaps he wished to have that office to dispose of like the rest. At any rate, he exacted a very large sum from Geoffrey as a condition on which he would grant him his peace, as he termed it, and Geoffrey paid the money. When by these and other similar means Richard had raised all that he could in England, he prepared to cross the Channel into Normandy, in order to see what more he could do there. Before he went, however, he had first to make arrangements for a regency to govern England while he should be away. This is always the custom in monarchical countries. Whenever for any reason the true sovereign cannot personally exercise the supreme power, whether from minority, insanity, long-continued sickness, or protracted absence from the realm, a regency, as it is called, is created to govern the kingdom in his stead. The person appointed to act as a regent is usually some near relation of the king. Richard's brother John hoped to be made regent, but this did not suit Richard's views, for he wished to make this office the means, as all the others had been, of raising money, and John had no money to give. For the same reason he could not appoint his mother, who in other respects would have been a very suitable person. So Richard contrived a sort of middle course. He sold the nominal regency to two wealthy courtiers, whom he associated together for the purpose. One was a bishop, and the other was an earl. It may perhaps be too much to say that he directly sold them the office, but at any rate he appointed them jointly to it, and under the arrangement that was made, he received a large sum of money. He, however, stipulated that John, and also his mother, should have a large share of influence in deciding upon all the measures of government. John would have been by no means satisfied with this divided and uncertain share of power, were it not that he was so desirous of favouring the expedition in every possible way, in hopes that if Richard could once get to the Holy Land, he would soon perish there, and that then he should be king altogether. It was of comparatively little consequence who was regent in the meantime, so he resolved to make no objection to any plan that the king might propose. Richard was now ready to cross to Normandy, but just before he went there came a deputation from Philip to consult with him in respect to the plans of the Crusade, and to fix upon the time for setting out. The time proposed by Philip was the latter part of March. It was now late in the fall. It would not be safe to set out before March on account of the inclemency of the season, and Richard supposed that he should have ample time to complete his preparations by the time that Philip named. So both parties agreed to it, and they took a solemn oath on both sides that they would all be ready without fail. Soon after this, Richard took leave of his friends, and accompanied by a long retinue of earls, barons, knights, and other adventurers who were to accompany him to the Holy Land, he left England and crossed the Channel to Normandy. In such cases as this, there are always a great many last words to be said, and a great many last arrangements to be made, and Richard found it necessary to see his mother and his brother John again, before finally taking his departure from Europe. So he sent for them to come to Normandy, and there another great council of state was held, at which everything in relation to the internal affairs of his dominions was finally arranged. There was still one other danger to be guarded against, and that was some treachery on the part of Philip himself. So little reliance did these valiant champions of Christianity place in each other in those days, that both Richard and Philip, in joining together to form this expedition, had many misgivings and suspicions in respect to each other's honesty. Undoubtedly, neither of them would have thought it safe to leave his dominions and go on a crusade unless the other had been going too. The one left behind would have been sure to found some pretext, during the absence of his neighbour, to invade his dominions and plunder him of some of his possessions. This was one reason why the two kings had agreed to go together, and now, as an additional safeguard, they made a formal treaty alliance and fraternity, in which they bound themselves by the most solemn oaths to stand by each other, and to be faithful and true to each other to the last. They agreed that each would defend the life and honour of the other on all occasions, that neither would desert the other in the hour of danger, and that in respect to the dominions that they were respectively to leave behind them, neither would form any designs against the other, but that Philip would cherish and protect the rights of Richard, even as he would protect his own city of Paris, and that Richard would do the like by Philip, even as he would protect his own city of Rouen. It is curious circumstance that in this treaty Richard should name Rouen and not London as his principal capital. It confirms what is known in many other ways, that the kings of this line, reigning over both Normandy and England, considered Normandy as the chief centre of their power, and England as subordinate. It may be, however, that one reason why Rouen was named in this instance may have been because it was nearer to the dominions of the King of France, and so better known to him. This treaty was signed in February, and the preparations were now nearly complete for setting forth on the expedition in March at the appointed time. End of chapter 6.
Chapter 7 of Richard the First. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ernst Patinama. Richard the First, by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 7. The Embarkation. The plan which Richard had formed for conveying his expedition to the Holy Land was to embark it on board a fleet of ships which he was sending round to Marseille for this purpose, with orders to await him there. Marseille is in the south of France, not far from the Mediterranean Sea. Richard might have embarked his troops in the English Channel, but that, as the reader will see from looking on the map of Europe, would require them to take a long sea voyage around the coasts of France and Spain, and through the Straits of Gibraltar. Richard thought it best to avoid this long circuit for his troops, and so he sent the ships round, with no more men on board than necessary to manoeuvre them, while he marched his army across France by land. As for Philip, he had no ships of his own. England was a maritime country, and had long possessed a fleet. This fleet had been very much increased by the exertions of Henry II, Richard's father, who had built several new ships, some of them of very large size, expressly for the purpose of transporting troops to Palestine. Henry himself did not live to execute his plans, and so he left his ships for Richard. France, on the other hand, was not then a maritime country. Most of the harbours on the northern coast belonged to Normandy, and even in the south the ports did not belong to the King of France. Philip, therefore, had no fleet of his own, but he had made arrangements with the Republic of Genoa to furnish him with ships, and so his plan was to march over the mountains to that city and embark there, while Richard should go south to Marseille. Richard drew up a curious set of rules and regulations for the government of this fleet while it was making the passage. Some of the rules were the following. 1. That if any man killed another, the murder was to be lashed to the dead body and buried alive with it, if the murder was committed in port or on the land. If the crime was committed at sea, then the two bodies, bound together as before, were to be launched overboard. 2. If any man, with a knife or with any other weapon, struck another so as to draw blood, then he was to be punished by being ducked 3 times over head and ears, by being let down from the yard arm of the ship into the sea. 3. For all sorts of profane and abusive language, the punishment was a fine of an ounce of silver for each offence. 4. Any man convicted of theft, or pickery as it was called, was to have his head shaved and hot pitch poured over it, and upon that the feathers of some pillow or cushion were to be shaken. The offender was then to be turned ashore on the first land that the ship might reach, and there be abandoned to his fate. The penalty named in this last article is the first instance in which any account of the punishment of tarring and feathering is mentioned, and this is supposed to be the origin of that extraordinary and very cruel mode of punishment. The king put a fleet under the command of 3 grand officers of his court, and he commanded all his seamen and marines to obey them strictly in all things, as they would obey the king himself if he had been on board. The fleet met with a great variety of adventures on its way to Marseille. It had not proceeded far before a great tempest arose and scattered the ships in every direction. At last a considerable number of them succeeded in making their way, in a disabled condition, into the Tagus, in order to seek succor in Lisbon. The King of Portugal was at this time at war with the Moors, who had come over from Africa and invaded his dominions. He proposed to the Crusaders on board the ships to wait a little while, and assist him in fighting the Moors. "They are as great infidels," said he, "as any that you will find in the Holy Land." The commanders of the fleet acceded to this proposal, but the crews, when they were landed, soon made so many raids in Lisbon, and involved themselves in such frequent and bloody affrays with the people of the city, that the King of Portugal was soon eager to send them away. So in due time they embarked again in order to continue the voyage. In the meantime, while the fleet was thus going round by sea, Richard and Philip were engaged in assembling the forces and making preparation to march by land. The two armies, when finally organized, came together at a place of rendezvous called Vézelay, where there were great plains suitable for the camping ground of a great military force. Vézelay was on the road to Lyon, and the armies, after they had met, marched in company to the latter city. The number of troops assembled was very great. The united army amounted, it is said, to 100,000 men. This was a very large force for those days. The great difficulty was to find provision for them from day to day during the march. Supplies of provisions for such a host cannot be carried far, so that armies are obliged to live on the produce of the country that they march through, which is collected for this purpose by foragers from day to day. The allied armies, as they moved slowly on, impoverished and distressed the whole country through which they passed, by devouring everything that the people had in store. At length, after marching together for some time, they came to the place where the roads separated, and King Philip turned off to the left in order to proceed through the passes of the Alps toward Genoa, while Richard and his hosts proceeded southward toward Marseille. When he reached Marseille, Richard found that his fleet had not arrived. The delay was occasioned by the storm and the subsequent detention of the crews at Lisbon. And yet it was very long after the time originally appointed for the sailing of the expedition. The time first appointed was the last of March, but Philip could not go at that time on account of the death of his queen, which took place just before the appointed period. Nor was Richard himself ready. It was not until the 30th of August that the fleet arrived at Marseille. When Richard found that the fleet had not come, he was greatly disappointed. He had no means of knowing when to expect it, for there were no postal or other communications across the country in those days, as now, by which tidings could be conveyed to him. He waited 8 days very impatiently, and then concluded to go on himself toward the east, and leave orders for the fleet to follow him. So he hired 10 large vessels and 20 galleys of the merchants of Marseille, and in these he embarked a portion of his forces, leaving the rest to come in the great fleet when it should arrive. They were to proceed to Messina in Sicily, where Richard was to join them. With the vessels that he had hired, he proceeded along the coast to Genoa, where he found Philip, the French king, who had arrived there safely before him by land. From Marseille to Genoa, the course lies toward the northeast along the coast of France. Thence, in going toward Messina, it turns toward the southeast and follows the coast of Italy. The route may be traced very easily on any map of modern Europe. The reason why Messina had been appointed as the great intermediate rendezvous of the fleet was twofold. In the first place, it was a convenient port for this purpose, being a good harbor, and being favorably situated about midway of the voyage. Then, besides, Richard had a sister residing there. Her name was Joanna. She had married the king of the country. Her husband had died, it is true, and she was, at that time, in some sense retired from public life. She was indeed in some distress, for the throne had been seized by a certain Tancred, who was her enemy, and, as she maintained, not the rightful successor of her husband. So Richard resolved, in stopping at Messina, to inquire into and redress his sister's wrongs, or rather, he thought the occasion offered him a favorable opportunity to interfere in the affairs of Sicily, and to lord it over the government and people there in his usual arrogant and domineering manner. After waiting a short time at Genoa, Richard set sail again in one of his small vessels, and proceeded to the southward along the coast of Italy. He touched at several places on the coast, in order to visit celebrated cities or other places of interest. He sailed up the river Arno, which you will find on the map, flowing into the Gulf of Genoa, a little to the northward of Leghorn. There are two renowned cities on this river which are very much visited by tourists and travellers of the present day: Florence and Pisa. Pisa is near the mouth of the river. Florence is much farther inland. Richard sailed up as far as Pisa. After visiting that city, he returned again to the mouth of the river, and then proceeded on his way down the coast until he came to the Tiber, and entered that river. He landed at Ostia, a small port near the mouth of it, the port, in fact, of Rome. One reason why he landed at Ostia was that the galley in which he was making the voyage required some repairs, and this was a convenient place for making them. Perhaps, too, it was his intention to visit Rome. But while at Ostia he became involved in a quarrel with the bishop that resided there, which led him at length to leave Ostia abruptly, and to refuse to go to Rome. The cause of the quarrel was the bishop's asking him to pay some money that he owed the Pope. In all the Catholic countries of Europe in those days there were certain taxes and fees that were collected for the Pope, the income from which was of great importance in making up the papal revenues. Now Richard, in his eagerness to secure all the money he could obtain in England to supply his wants for the Crusade, had appropriated to his own use certain of these church funds, and the bishop now called upon him to reimburse them. This application, as might have been expected, made Richard extremely angry. He assailed the bishop with the most violent and abusive language, and charged all sorts of corruption and wickedness against the papal government itself. These charges may have been true, but the occasion of being called upon to pay a debt was not a proper time for making them. To make the faults or misconduct of others, whether real or pretended, an excuse for not rendering them their just dues, is a very base proceeding. As soon as Richard's galley was repaired, he embarked on board of it in a rage, and sailed away. The next point at which he landed was Naples. Richard was greatly delighted with the city of Naples, which, rising as it does from the shores of an enchanting bay, and near the base of the volcano Vesuvius, has long been celebrated for the romantic beauty of its situation. Richard remained at Naples several days. There is an account of his going, while there, to perform his devotions in the crypt of a church. The crypt is a subterranean apartment beneath the church, the floors above it, as well as the pillars and walls of the church, being supported by immense piers and arches, which give the crypt the appearance of a dungeon. The place is commonly used for tombs and places of sepulture for the dead. In the crypt where Richard worshipped at Naples, the dead bodies were arranged in niches all around the walls. They were dressed as they had been when alive, and their countenances, dry and shriveled, were exposed to view, presenting a ghastly and horrid spectacle. It was such means as these that were resorted to in the Middle Ages for making religious impressions on the minds of men. After spending some days in Naples, Richard concluded that he would continue his route, but instead of embarking at once on board his galley, he determined to go across the mountains by land to Salerno, which town lies on the sea-coast at some distance south of Naples. By looking at any map of Italy, you will observe that a great promontory puts out into the sea just below Naples, forming the Gulf of Salerno on the south side of it. The path through the mountains which Richard followed led across the neck of this promontory. His galley, together with the other galleys that accompanied him, he sent round by water. There was a great deal to interest him at Salerno, for it was a place where many parties of crusaders, Normans among the rest, had landed before, and they had built churches and monasteries, and founded institutions of learning there, all of which Richard was much interested in visiting. He accordingly remained in Salerno several days, until at length his fleet of galleys, which had come round from Naples by sea, arrived. Richard, however, in the meantime, had found travelling by land so agreeable that he concluded to continue his journey in that way, leaving his fleet to sail down the coast, keeping all the time as near as possible to the shore. The king himself rode on upon the land, accompanied by a very small troop of attendants. His way led him sometimes among the mountains of the interior, and sometimes near the margin of the shore. At some points, where the road approached so near to the cliffs as to afford a good view of the sea, the fleet of galleys were to be seen in the offing, prosperously pursuing their voyage. The king went on in this way till he reached Calabria, which is the country situated in the southern portion of Italy. The roads here were very bad, and as the autumn was now coming on, many of the streams became so swollen with rains that it was difficult sometimes for him to proceed on his way. At one time, while he was thus journeying, he became involved in a difficulty with a party of peasants which was extremely discreditable to him, and exhibits his character in a very unfavourable light. It seems that he was travelling by an obscure country road in company with only a single attendant, when he happened to pass by a village where he was told a peasant lived who had a very fine hunting hawk or falcon. Hunting by means of these hawks was a common amusement of the knights and nobles of those days, and Richard, when he heard about this hawk, said that a plain countryman had no business with such a bird. He declared that he would go to his house and take it away from him. This act, so characteristic of the despotic arrogance which marked Richard's character, shows that the reckless ferocity for which he was so renowned was not softened or alleviated by any true and genuine nobleness or generosity. For a rich and powerful king thus to rob a poor helpless peasant, and on such a pretext too, was as base a deed as we can well conceive a royal personage to perform. Richard at once proceeded to carry his design into execution. He went into the peasant's house, and, having under some pretext or other got possession of the falcon, he began to ride away with the bird on his wrist. The peasant called out to him to give him back his bird. Richard paid no attention to him, but rode on. The peasant then called for help, and other villagers joining him, they followed the king, each one having seized in the meantime such weapons as came most readily to hand. They surrounded the king in order to take the falcon away, while he attempted to beat them off with his sword. Pretty soon he broke his sword by a blow which he struck at one of the peasants, and then he was in a great measure defenceless. His only safety now was in flight. He contrived to force his way through the circle that surrounded him, and began to gallop away, followed by his attendant. At length he succeeded in reaching a priory, where he was received and protected from farther danger, having in the meantime given up the falcon. When the excitement had subsided, he resumed his journey, and at length, without farther adventures, reached the coast at the point nearest to Sicily. Here he passed the night in a tent, which he pitched upon the rocks on the shore, waiting for arrangements to be made on the next day for his public entrance into the harbour of Messina, which lay just opposite to him, across the narrow strait that here separates the island of Sicily from the mainland. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Ernst Patinama, Amsterdam, the Netherlands.
Chapter 8 of Richard the First. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Richard I by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 8. King Richard at Messina. Although Richard came down to the Italian shore, opposite to Messina, almost unattended and alone, and under circumstances so ignoble, fugitive as he was from a party of peasants whom he had incensed by an act of petty robbery, he yet made his entry at last into the town itself with a great display of pomp and parade. He remained on the Italian side of the strait, after he arrived on the shore, until he had sent over to Messina, and informed the officers of his fleet, which by the way had already arrived there, that he had come. The whole fleet immediately got ready, and came over to the Italian side to take Richard on board and escort him over. Richard entered the harbor with his fleet as if he were a conqueror returning home. The ships and galleys were all fully manned and gaily decorated, and Richard arranged such a number of musicians on the decks of them to blow trumpets and horns as the fleet sailed along the shores, and entered the harbor, that the air was filled with the echoes of them, and the whole country was called out by the sound. The Sicilians were quite alarmed to see so formidable a host of foreign soldiers coming among them, and even their allies, the French, were not pleased. Philip began to be jealous of Richard's superior power, and to be alarmed at his assuming and arrogant demeanor. Philip had arrived in Messina some time before this, but his fleet, which was originally an inferior one, having consisted of such vessels only as he could hire at Genoa, had been greatly injured by storms during the passage, so that he had reached Messina in a very crippled condition. And now to see Richard coming in, apparently so much his superior, and with so evident a disposition to make a parade of his superiority, made him anxious and uneasy. The same feeling manifested itself, too, among his troops, and this to such a degree as to threaten to break out into open quarrels between the soldiers of the two armies. "It will never answer," thought Philip, "for us both to remain long at Messina, so I will set out again myself as soon as I possibly can." Indeed, there was another very decisive reason for Philip soon continuing his voyage, and that was the necessity of diminishing the number of soldiers now at Messina on account of the difficulty of finding sustenance for them all. Philip accordingly made all haste to refit his fleet and to sail away, but he was again unfortunate. He encountered another storm, and was obliged to put back again, and before he could be ready a second time, the winter set in, and he was obliged to give up all hope of leaving Sicily until the spring. The two kings had foreseen this difficulty, and had earnestly endeavored to avoid it by making all their arrangements in the first instance for setting out from England and France in March, which was the earliest possible season for navigating the Mediterranean safely with such vessels as they had in those days. But this plan, the reader will recollect, had been frustrated by the death of Philip's queen, and the delays attendant upon that event, as well as other delays arising from other causes, and it was past midsummer before the expedition was ready to take its departure. The kings had still hoped to have reached the Holy Land before winter, but now they found themselves stopped on the way, and Philip, with many misgivings in respect to the result, prepared to make the best arrangements that he could for putting his men into winter quarters. Richard did, in the end, become involved in difficulties with Philip and with the French troops, but the most serious affair which occupied his attention was a very extraordinary quarrel which he instigated between himself and the king of the country. The name of this king was Tancred. The kingdom of Sicily in those days included not merely the island of Sicily, but also nearly all the southern part of Italy, all that part, namely, which forms the foot and ankle of Italy, as seen upon the map. It has already been said that Richard's sister Joanna, some years ago, married the king of this country. The name of the king whom Joanna married was William, and he was now dead. Tancred was his successor, though not the regular and rightful heir. In order that the reader may understand the nature of the quarrel which broke out between Tancred and Richard, it is necessary to explain how it happened that Tancred succeeded to the throne. If William, Joanna's husband, had had a son, he would have been the rightful successor. But William had no children, and some time before his death he gave up all expectation of ever having any, so he began to look around and consider who should be his heir. He fixed his mind upon a lady, the Princess Constance, who was his cousin and his nearest relative. She would have been the heir had it not been that the usages of the realm did not allow a woman to reign. There was another relative of William, a young man named Tancred. For some reasons, William was very unwilling that Tancred should succeed him. He knew, however, that the people would be extremely averse to receive Constance as their sovereign instead of Tancred, on account of her being a woman. But he thought that he might obviate this objection in some degree by arranging a marriage for her with some powerful prince. This he finally succeeded in doing. The prince whom he chose was a son of the Emperor of Germany. His name was Henry. Constance was married to him, and after her marriage she left Sicily and went home with her husband. William then assembled all his barons, and made them take an oath of allegiance to Constance and Henry as rightful sovereigns after his decease. Supposing everything to be thus amicably arranged, he settled himself quietly in his capital, the city of Palermo, intending to live there in peace with his wife for the remainder of his days. When he married Joanna, he had given her, for her dower, a large territory of rich estates in Italy. These estates were all together, and comprised what is called the promontory of Monte Gargano. You will see this promontory represented on any map of Italy by a small projection on the hill, or rather a little way above the Hill of the Foot, on the eastern side of the peninsula. It is nearly opposite to Naples. This territory was large, and contained, besides a number of valuable landed estates, several castles, with lakes and forests adjoining; also 2 monasteries, with their pastures, woods, and vineyards, and several beautiful lakes. These estates, and all the income from them, were secured to Joanna forever. Not very long after William had completed his arrangements for the succession, he died unexpectedly, while Constance was away from the kingdom, at home with her husband. Immediately a great number of competitors started up and claimed the crown. Among them was Tancred. Tancred took the field, and after a desperate contest with his rivals, at length carried the day. He considered Joanna, the Queen Dowager, as his enemy, and either confiscated her estates or allowed others to seize them. He then took her with him to Palermo, where, as Richard was led to believe, he kept her a prisoner. All these things happened a few months only before Richard arrived in Messina. Palermo, as you will see from any map of Sicily, lies near the northwest corner of Sicily, and Messina near the northeast. In consequence of these occurrences, it happened that when Richard landed in Sicily he found his sister, the wife of the former king of the country, a widow and a prisoner, and her estates confiscated, while a person whom he considered a usurper was on the throne. A better state of things to furnish him with a pretext for aggressions on the country or the people he could not possibly have desired. As soon as he had landed his troops, he formed a great encampment for them on the seashore, outside the town. The place of the encampment was bordered at one extremity by the suburbs of the town, and at the other extremity was a monastery built on a height. As soon as Richard had established himself here, he sent a delegation to Tancred at Palermo, demanding that he should release Joanna and send her to him. Tancred denied that Joanna had been imprisoned at all, and, at any rate, he immediately acceded to her brother's demand that she should be sent to him. He placed her on board one of his own royal galleys, and caused her to be conveyed in it, with a very honourable escort, to Messina, and there delivered up to Richard's care. In respect to the dower which Richard had demanded that he should restore, Tancred commenced giving some explanations in regard to it, but Richard was too impatient to listen to them. "We will not wait," said he to his sister, "to hear any talking on the subject. We will go and take possession of the territory ourselves." So he embarked a part of his army on board some ships, and transported them across the straits, and landing on the Italian shore, he seized a castle and a portion of territory surrounding it. He put a strong garrison in the castle, and gave the command of it to Joanna, while he went back to Messina to strengthen the position of the remainder of his army there. He thought that the monastery which flanked his encampment on the side farthest from the town would make a good fortress if he had possession of it, and that, if well fortified, it would strengthen very much the defences of his encampment in case Tancred should attempt to molest him. So he at once took possession of it. He turned the monks out of doors, removed all the sacred implements and emblems, and turned the buildings into a fortress. He put in a garrison of soldiers to guard it, and filled the rooms which the monks had been accustomed to use for their studies and their prayers with stores of arms and ammunition brought in from the ships, and with other apparatus of war. His object was to be ready to meet Tancred, at a moment's warning, if he should attempt to attack him. Soon after this a very serious difficulty broke out between the soldiers of the army and the people of Messina. There is almost always difficulty between the soldiers of an army and the people of any town near which the army is encamped. The soldiers, brutal in their passions, and standing in awe of none but their own officers, are often exceedingly violent and unjust in their demeanor toward unarmed and helpless citizens, and the citizens, though they usually endure very long and very patiently, sometimes become aroused to resentment and retaliation at last. In this case, parties of Richard's soldiers went into Messina, and behaved so outrageously toward the inhabitants, and especially toward the young women, that the indignation of the husbands and fathers was excited to the highest degree. The soldiers were attacked in the streets. Several of them were killed. The rest fled, and were pursued by the crowd of citizens to the gates. Those that escaped went to the camp, breathless with excitement and burning with rage, and called upon all their fellow soldiers to join them and revenge their wrongs. A great riot was created, and bands of furious men, hastily collected together, advanced toward the city, brandishing their arms and uttering furious cries, determined to break through the gates and kill everybody that they could find. Richard heard of the danger just in time to mount his horse and ride to the gates of the city, and there to head off the soldiers and drive them back. But they were so furious that for a time they would not hear him, but still pressed on. He was obliged to ride in among them, and actually beat them back with his truncheon, before he could compel them to give up their design. The next day a meeting of the chief officers in the two armies, with the chief magistrates and some of the principal citizens of Messina, was held to consider what to do to settle this dispute, and to prevent future outbreaks of this character. But the state of excitement between the two parties was too great to be settled yet in any amicable manner. While the conference was proceeding, a great crowd of people from the town collected on a rising ground just above the place where the conference was sitting. They said they only came as spectators. Richard alleged, on the other hand, that they were preparing to attack the conference. At any rate, they were excited and angry, and assumed a very threatening attitude. Some Normans who approached them got into an altercation with them, and at length one of the Normans was killed, and the rest cried out, "To arms!" The conference broke up in confusion. Richard rushed to the camp and called out his men. He was in a state of fury. Philip did all in his power to allay the storm and to prevent a combat, and when he found that Richard would not listen to him, he declared that he had a great mind to join with the Sicilians and fight him. This, however, he did not do, but contented himself with doing all he could to calm the excitement of his angry ally. But Richard was not to be controlled. He rushed on, at the head of his troops, up the hill to the ground where the Sicilians were assembled. He attacked them furiously. They were to some extent armed, but they were not organized, and of course they could not stand against the charge of the soldiers. They fled in confusion toward the city. Richard and his troops followed them, killing as many of them as they could in the pursuit. The Sicilians crowded into the city and shut the gates. Of course the whole town was now alarmed, and all the people that could fight were marshaled on the walls at the gates to defend themselves. Richard retired for a brief period till he could bring on a larger force, and then made a grand attack on the walls. Several of his officers and soldiers were killed by darts and arrows from the battlements, but at length the walls were taken by storm, the gates were opened, and Richard marched in at the head of the troops. When the people were entirely subdued, Richard hung out his flag on a high tower in token that he had taken full and formal possession of Tancred's capital. Philip remonstrated against this very strongly, but Richard declared that now that he had got possession of Messina, he would keep possession until Tancred came to terms with him in respect to his sister Joanna. Philip insisted that he should not do this, but threatened to break off the alliance unless Richard would give up the town. Finally the matter was compromised by Richard agreeing that he would take down the flag and withdraw from the town himself, and for the present put it under the government of certain knights that he and Philip should jointly appoint for this purpose. After the excitement of this affair had a little subsided, Richard and Philip began to consider how unwise it was for them to quarrel with each other, engaged as they were together in an enterprise of such magnitude and of so much hazard, and one in which it was impossible for them to hope to succeed unless they continued united, and so they became reconciled, or at least pretended to be so, and made new vows of eternal friendship and brotherhood. Still, notwithstanding these protestations, Richard went on lording it over the Sicilians in the most high-handed manner. Some nobles of high rank were so indignant at these proceedings that they left the town. Richard immediately confiscated their estates and converted the proceeds to his own use. He proceeded to fortify his encampment more and more. The monastery which he had forcibly taken from the monks he turned into a complete castle. He made battlements on the walls, and surrounded the whole with a moat. He also built another castle on the hills commanding the town. He acted, in a word, in all respects as if he considered himself master of the country. He did not consult Philip at all in respect to any of these proceedings, and he paid no attention to the remonstrances that Philip from time to time addressed to him. Philip was exceedingly angry, but he did not see what he could do. Tancred, too, began to be very much alarmed. He wished to know of Richard what it was that he demanded in respect to Joanna. Richard said he would consider and let him know. In a short time he made known his terms as follows. He said that Tancred must restore to his sister all the territories which, as he alleged, had belonged to her, and also give her a golden chair, a golden table 12 feet long and 1.5 feet broad, 2 golden supports for the same, 4 silver cups, and 4 silver dishes. He pretended that, by a custom of the realm, she was entitled to these things. He also demanded for himself a very large contribution toward the armament and equipment for the Crusade. It seems that at one period during the lifetime of William, Joanna's husband, her father, King Henry of England, was planning a crusade, and that William, by a will which he had made at that time, so at least Richard maintained, had bequeathed a large contribution toward the necessary means for fitting it out. The items were these: 1. 60,000 measures of wheat. 2. The same quantity of barley. 3. A fleet of 1,000 armed galleys, equipped and provisioned for 2 years. 4. A silken tent large enough to accommodate 200 knights sitting at a banquet. These particulars show on how great a scale these military expeditions for conquering the Holy Land were conducted in those days, the above list being only a complimentary contribution to one of them by a friend of the leader of it. Richard now maintained that his father Henry had died without going on the Crusade, still he himself was going, and that he, being the son, and consequently the representative and heir of Henry, was as such entitled to receive the bequest, so he called upon Tancred to pay it. After much negotiation, the dispute was settled by Richard's waiving these claims, and arranging the matter on a new and different basis. He had a nephew named Arthur. Arthur was yet very young, being only about 2 years old, and as Richard had no children of his own, Arthur was his presumptive heir. Tancred had a daughter, yet an infant. Now it was finally proposed that Arthur and this young daughter of Tancred should be affianced, and that Tancred should pay to Richard 20,000 pieces of gold as her dowry. Richard was, of course, to take this money as the guardian and trustee of his nephew, and he was to engage that, if anything should occur hereafter to prevent the marriage from taking place, he would refund the money. Tancred was also to pay Richard 20,000 pieces of gold besides, in full settlement of all claims in behalf of Joanna. These terms were finally agreed to on both sides. Richard also entered into a league, offensive and defensive, with Tancred, agreeing to assist him in maintaining his position as King of Sicily against all his enemies. This is a very important circumstance to be remembered, for the chief of Tancred's enemies was the Emperor Henry of Germany, the prince who had married Constance, as has been already related. Henry's father had died, and he had become Emperor of Germany himself, and he now claimed Sicily as the inheritance of Constance his wife, according to the will of King William, Joanna's husband. Tancred, he maintained, was a usurper, and of course now Richard, by his league, offensive and defensive, with Tancred, made himself Henry's enemy. This led him into serious difficulty with Henry at a subsequent period, as we shall by and by see. The treaty between Richard and Tancred was drawn up in due form and duly executed, and it was sent for safe keeping to Rome, and there deposited with the Pope. Tancred paid Richard the money, and he immediately began to squander it in the most lavish and extravagant manner. He expended the infant princess's dower, which he held in trust for Arthur, as freely as he did the other money. Indeed, this was a very common way in those days for great kings to raise money. If they had had a young son or heir, no matter how young he was, they would contract to give him in marriage to the little daughter of some other potentate on condition of receiving some town or castle or province, or large sum of money as dower. The idea was, of course, that they were to take this dower in charge for the young prince, to keep it for him until he should become old enough to be actually married, but in reality they would take possession of the property themselves, and convert it at once to their own use. Richard himself had been affianced in this way in his infancy to Alice, the daughter of the then reigning King of France, and the sister of Philip, and his father, King Henry II., had received and appropriated the dowry. Indeed, in this case, both the sums of money that Richard received from Tancred were paid to Richard in trust, or at least ought to have been so regarded, the one amount being for Arthur and the other for Joanna. Richard himself, in his own name, had no claims on Tancred whatever, but as soon as the money came into his hands, he began to expend it in the most profuse and lavish manner. He adopted a very extravagant and ostentatious style of living. He made costly presents to the barons, and knights, and officers of the armies, including the French army as well as his own, and gave them most magnificent entertainments. Philip thought that he did this to secure popularity, and that the presents which he made to the French knights and nobles were designed to entice them away from their allegiance and fidelity to him, their lawful sovereign. At Christmas he gave a splendid entertainment, to which he invited every person of the rank of a knight or a gentleman in both armies, and at the close of the feast he made a donation in money to each of the guests, the sum being different in different cases, according to the rank and station of the person who received it. The king, having thus at last settled his quarrels and established himself in something like peace in Sicily, began to turn his attention toward the preparations for the spring. Of course his intention was, as soon as the spring should open, to set sail with his fleet and army, and proceed toward the Holy Land. He now caused all his ships to be examined with a view to ascertain what repairs they needed. Some had been injured by the storms which they had encountered on the way from Marseilles, or by accidents of the sea. Others had become worm-eaten and leaky by lying in port. Richard caused them all to be put thoroughly in repair. He also caused a number of battering engines to be constructed of timber which his men hauled from the forest around the base of Mount Etna. These engines were for assailing the walls of the towns and fortresses in the Holy Land. In modern times walls are always attacked with mortars and cannon. The ordnance of the present day will throw shot and shells of prodigious weight 2 or 3 miles, and these tremendous missiles strike against the walls of a fortress with such force as in a short time to batter them down, no matter how strong and thick they may be. But in those days gunpowder was not in use, and the principal means of breaking down a wall was by the battering ram, which consisted of a heavy beam of wood, hung by a rope or chain from a massive frame, and then swung against the gate or wall which it was intended to break through. In the engraving you see such a ram suspended from the frame, with men at work below, impelling it against a gateway. Sometimes these battering rams were very large and heavy, and the men drew them back and forth in striking the wall with them, by means of ropes. There are accounts of some battering rams which weighed 40 or 50 tons, and required 1,500 men to work them. The men, of course, were very much exposed while engaged in this operation, for the people whom they were besieging would gather on the walls above, and shoot spears, darts, and arrows at them, and throw down stones and other missiles, as you see in the engraving. Then, besides, the battering ram, though very efficient against walls, was of no service against men. There were other engines made in those days which were designed to throw stones or monstrous darts. These last were, of course, designed to operate against bodies of men. They were made in various forms, and were called catapults, ballistas, mangonels, and by other such names. The force with which they operated consisted of springs made by elastic bars of wood, twisted ropes, and other such contrivances. Some were for throwing stones, others for monstrous darts. Of course, these engines required for their construction heavy frames of sound timber. Richard did not expect to find such timber in the Holy Land, nor did he wish to consume the time after he should arrive in making them, so he employed the winter in constructing a great number of these engines, and in packing them, in parts, on board his galleys. Richard performed a great religious ceremony, too, while he was at Sicily this winter, as a part of the preparation which he deemed it necessary to make for the campaign. It is a remarkable fact that every great military freebooter that has organized an armed gang of men to go forth and rob and murder his fellow men, in any age of the world, has considered some great religious performance necessary at the outset of the work, to prepare the minds of his soldiers for it, and to give them the necessary resolution and confidence in it. It was so with Alexander. It was so with Xerxes and with Darius. It was so with Pyrrhus. It is so substantially at the present day, when in all wars each side makes itself the champion of heaven in the contest, and causes Te Deums to be chanted in their respective churches, now on this side and now on that, in pretended gratitude to God for their alternate victories. Richard called a grand convention of all the prelates and monks that were with his army, and performed a solemn act of worship. A part of the performance consisted of his kneeling personally before the priests, confessing his sins and the wicked life that he had led, and making very fervent promises to sin no more, and then, after submitting to the penances which they enjoined upon him, receiving from them pardon and absolution. After the enactment of this solemnity, the soldiers felt far more safe and strong in going forth to the work which lay before them in the Holy Land than before. Nor is it certain that in this act Richard was wholly hypocritical and insincere. The human heart is a mansion of many chambers, and a religious sentiment, and in no small degree conscientious and honest, though hollow and mistaken, may have strong possession of some of them, while others are filled to overflowing with the dear and besetting sins, whatever they are, by which the general conduct of the man is controlled. End of chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of Richard the First. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alana Jordan. Richard the First by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 9. Berengaria. While Richard was in the kingdom of Sicily, during this memorable winter, he made a new contract of marriage. The lady was a Spanish princess named Berengaria. The circumstances of this betrothment were somewhat extraordinary. The reader will recollect that he had been betrothed in his earliest youth to Alice, an infant princess of France. His father had thrown him in, as it were, as sort of a make-weight in arranging some compromise with the King of France for the settlement of a quarrel, and also to obtain the dower of the young princess for his own use. This dower consisted of various castles and estates, which were immediately put into the hands of Henry, Richard's father, and which he continued to hold as long as he lived, using and enjoying the rents and revenues from them as his own property. When Richard grew old enough to claim his bride, Henry, under whose custody and charge she had been placed, would not give her up to him, and long and serious quarrels arose between the father and the son on this account, as has already been related in this volume. The most obvious reason for which Henry might be supposed unwilling to give up Alice to her affianced husband when he became old enough to be married to her was that he wished to retain longer the use of the castles and estates that constituted her dowry. But in addition to this, it was surmised by many that he had actually fallen in love with her himself, and that he was determined that Richard should not have her at all. Richard himself believed, or pretended to believe, that this was the case. He was consequently very angry, and he justified himself in the wars and rebellions that he raised against his father during the lifetime of the king by this great wrong which he alleged that his father had done him. On the other hand, many persons supposed that Richard did not really wish to marry Alice, and that he only made the fact of his father's withholding her from him a pretext for his unnatural hostility, the real ends and aims of which were objects altogether different. However this may be, when Henry died, and there was no longer anything in the way of his marriage, he showed no desire to consummate it. Alice's father, too, had died, and Philip, the present King of France and Richard's ally, was her brother. Philip called upon Richard from time to time to complete the marriage, but Richard found various pretexts for postponing it, and thus the matter stood when the expedition for the Holy Land set sail from Marseilles. The next reason why Richard did not now wish to carry his marriage with Alice into effect was that, in the meantime, while his father had been withholding Alice from him, he had seen and fallen in love with another lady, the Princess Berengaria. Richard first saw Berengaria several years before, at a time when he was with his mother in Aquitaine, during the life of his father. The first time that he saw her was at a grand tournament, which was celebrated in her native city in Spain, and which Richard went to attend. The families had been well acquainted with each other before, though until the tournament Richard had never seen Berengaria. Richard had, however, known one of her brothers from his boyhood, and they had always been very good friends. The father of Berengaria, too, Sancho the Wise, King of Navarre, had always been a warm friend of Eleonora, Richard's mother, and in the course of the difficulties and quarrels that took place between her and her husband, as related in the early chapters of this volume, he had rendered her very valuable services. Still, Richard never saw Berengaria until she had grown up to womanhood. He, however, felt a strong desire to see her, for she was quite celebrated for her beauty and her accomplishments. The accomplishments in which she excelled were chiefly music and poetry. Richard himself was greatly interested in these arts, especially in the songs of the troubadours, whose performances always formed a very important part of the entertainment at the feasts and tournaments, and other great public celebrations of those days. When Richard came to see Berengaria, he fell deeply in love with her, but he could not seek her hand in marriage on account of his engagement with Alice. To have given up Alice, and to have entered instead into an engagement with her, would have involved both him and his mother, and all the family of Berengaria too, in a fierce quarrel with the King of France, the father of Alice, and also with his own father. These were too serious consequences for him to brave while he was still only a prince, and nominally under his father's authority. So he did nothing openly, though a strong secret attachment sprang up between him and Berengaria, and all desire ever to make Alice his wife gradually disappeared. At length, when his father died, and Richard became King of England, he felt at once that the power was now in his own hands, and that he would do as he liked in respect to his marriage. Alice's father, too, had died, and her brother Philip was now king, and he was not likely to feel so strong an interest in resenting any supposed slight to his sister as her father would have been. Richard determined, therefore, to give up Alice altogether, and asked Berengaria to be his wife. So, while he was engaged in England in making his preparations for the Crusade, and when he was nearly ready to set out, he sent his mother, Eleonora, to Navarre to ask Berengaria in marriage of her father, King Sancho. He did not, however, give Philip any notice of this change in his plans, not wishing to embarrass the alliance that he and Philip were forming with any unnecessary difficulties which might interfere with the success of it, and retard the preparations for the Crusade. So, while his mother had gone to Spain to secure Berengaria for him as his wife, he himself, in England and Normandy, went on with his preparations for the Crusade in connection with Philip, just as if the original engagement with Alice was going regularly on. Eleonora was very successful in her mission. Sancho, Berengaria's father, was very much pleased with so magnificent an offer as that of the hand of Richard, Duke of Normandy and King of England, for his daughter. Berengaria herself made no objection. Eleonora said that her son had not been able to come himself and claim his bride, on account of the necessity that he was under of accompanying his army to the east, but she said that he would stop at Messina, and she proposed that Berengaria should put herself under her protection and go and join him there. Berengaria was a lady of an ardent and romantic temperament, and nothing could please her better than such a proposal as this. She very readily acceded to it, and her father was very willing to entrust her to the charge of Eleonora. So the two ladies, with the proper train of barons, knights, and other attendants, set out together. They crossed the Pyrenees into France, and then, after traversing France, they passed over the Alps into Italy. Thence they continued their journey down the Italian coast by land, as Richard had done by water, until at last they arrived at a place called Brindisi, which is on the coast of Italy, not far from Messina. Here they halted, and sent word to Richard to inform him of their arrival. Eleonora thought that Berengaria could not go any farther with propriety, for her engagement with Richard was not yet made public. Indeed, the betrothal of Richard with Alice still remained nominally in force, and a serious difficulty was to be apprehended with Philip so soon as the new plans which Richard had formed should be announced to him. Eleonora said that she could not remain long in Italy, but must return to Normandy very soon, without waiting for Richard to prepare the way for receiving his bride. So she left Berengaria under the charge of Joanna, who, being on her own, that is, Eleanor's daughter, was a very proper person to be the young lady's protector. Joanna and Berengaria immediately conceived a strong attachment for each other, and they lived together in a very happy manner. Joanna was glad to have for a companion so charming a young lady, and one of so high a rank, and Berengaria, on the other hand, was much pleased to be placed under the charge of so kind a protector. Joanna, too, having long lived in Sicily, could give Berengaria a great deal of interesting intelligence about the country and the people, and could answer all the thousand questions which she asked about what she heard and saw in the New World, as it were, into which she had been ushered. The two ladies lived, of course, in very close seclusion, but they lived so lovingly together that one of the writers of the day, in a ballad that he wrote, compared them to two birds in a cage. Speaking of Eleanora, he says, in the quaint old English of the day, "She beleft Beranger at Richard's costage. Queen Joanne held her dear. They lived as doves in a cage." The arrival of Berengaria at Brindisi took place in the spring of the year, when the time was drawing nigh for the fleets and armaments to sail for the East. As yet, Philip knew nothing of Richard's plans in respect to this new marriage, but the time had now arrived when Richard perceived that they could no longer be concealed. Philip entertained suspicions that something wrong was going on, though he did not know exactly what. His suspicions made him watchful and jealous, and at last they led to a curious train of circumstances which brought matters to a crisis very suddenly. It seems that at one time, when Richard was paying a visit to Tancred, the King of Sicily, Tancred showed him a letter which he said he had received from the French king. In this letter, Philip, if indeed Philip really wrote it, endeavored to excite Tancred's enmity against Richard. It was just after the treaty between Tancred and Richard had been formed, as related in the last chapter. The letter said that Richard was a treacherous man, in whom no reliance could be placed, that he had no intention of keeping the treaty that he had made, but was laying a scheme for attacking Tancred in his Sicilian dominions, and finally it closed with an offer on the part of the writer to assist Tancred in driving Richard and all his followers out of the island. The letter. When Richard read this letter, he was at first in a dreadful rage, and he broke out into an explosion of the most violent, profane, and passionate language that can be conceived. Presently he looked at the letter again, and on reperusing it, and carefully considering its contents, he declared that he did not believe that Philip ever wrote it. It was a stratagem of Tancred's, he thought, designed to promote a quarrel between Richard and his ally. Tancred assured him that Philip did write the letter, or at least that it was brought to him as from Philip by the Duke of Burgundy, one of his principal officers. "You may ask the Duke of Burgundy," said he, "and if he denies it, I will challenge him to a duel through one of my barons." It was necessary that the parties to a duel in those days should be of equal rank, so that, if a king had a quarrel with a nobleman of another nation, he could only send one of his own noblemen of the same rank to be his representative in the combat. But this proposal of sending another man to risk his life in maintaining the cause of his king on a question of veracity, in which the person so sent had no interest whatever, illustrates very curiously the ideas of those chivalrous times. Richard did not go to the Duke of Burgundy, but taking the letter which Tancred had shown him, he waited until he found a good opportunity, and then showed it to Philip. The two kings often fell into altercations and disputes in their interviews with each other, and it was in one of these that Richard produced the letter, offering it by way of recrimination to some charges or accusations which Philip was making against him. Philip denied having written the letter. It was a forgery, he said, and he believed that Richard himself was the author of it. "You are trying every way you can," said he, "to find pretexts for quarreling with me, and this is one of your devices. I know what you are aiming at. You wish to quarrel with me so as to find some excuse for breaking off your marriage with my sister, whom you are bound by a most solemn oath to marry. But of this you may be sure, that if you abandon her and take any other wife, you will find me, as long as you live, your most determined and mortal enemy." This declaration aroused Richard's temper and brought the affair at once to a crisis. Richard declared to Philip that he would never marry his sister. "My father," said he, "kept her from me for many years because he loved her himself, and she returned his love, and now I will never have anything to do with her. I am ready to prove to you the truth of what I say." So Richard brought forward what he called the proofs of the very intimate relations which had subsisted between Alice and his father. Whether there was anything genuine or conclusive in these proofs is not known. At all events, they made a very deep and painful impression on Philip. The disclosure was, as one of the writers of those times says, like a nail driven directly through his heart. After a while, the two kings concluded to settle the difficulty by a sort of compromise. Philip agreed to give up all claims on the part of Alice to Richard in consideration of a sum of money which Richard was to pay. Richard was to pay 2,000 marks a year for 5 years, and was on that condition to be allowed to marry anyone he chose. He was also to restore to Philip the fortresses and estates which had been conveyed to his father as Alice's dowry at the time of her betrothment to Richard in her infancy. This agreement, being thus made, was confirmed by a great profusion of oaths, sworn with all solemnity, and the affair was considered as settled. Still, Richard seems to have been a little disinclined to bring out Berengaria at once from her retreat, and let Philip know suddenly how far his arrangements for marrying another lady had gone, so he concluded to wait before publicly announcing his intended marriage until Philip should have sailed for the East. Philip was now, indeed, nearly ready to go. His fleet and his armament, being smaller than Richard's, could be dispatched earlier, so Richard devoted himself very earnestly to the work of facilitating and hastening his ally's departure, determining that immediately afterward he would bring forward his bride and celebrate his marriage. It is not, however, certain that he kept his intended marriage with Berengaria an absolute secret from Philip. There would be no longer any special necessity for this after the treaty that had been made. But, notwithstanding this agreement, it is not to be supposed that the new marriage would be a very agreeable subject for Philip to contemplate, or that it would be otherwise than very awkward for him to be present on the occasion of the celebration of it. So Richard decided that, on all accounts, it was best to postpone the ceremony until after Philip had gone. Philip sailed the very last of March. Richard selected from his fleet a few of his most splendid galleys, and with these, filled with a chosen company of knights and barons, he accompanied Philip as he left the harbor, and sailed with him down the straits of Messina, with trumpets sounding and flags and banners waving in the air. As soon as Philip's fleet reached the open sea, Richard took leave and set out with his galleys on his return. But instead of going back to Messina, he made the best of his way to the port in Italy where Berengaria and Joanna were lodging, and there took the ladies, who were already expecting him, and embarking them on board a very elegantly adorned galley which he had prepared for them, he conducted them to Messina. Richard would now probably have been immediately married, but it was in the season of Lent, and according to the ideas of those times, it would be in some sense a desecration of that holy season of fasting to celebrate any such joyous ceremony as a wedding in it, and it would not do very well to postpone the sailing of the fleet until after the season of Lent should have expired, for the time had already fully arrived when it ought to sail, and Philip, with his division of the allied force, had already gone, so he concluded to put off his marriage till they should reach the next place at which the expedition should land. Berengaria consented to this, and it was arranged that she was to accompany the expedition when it should sail, and that at the next place of landing, which it was expected would be the island of Rhodes, the marriage ceremony should be performed. As it was not considered quite proper, however, under these circumstances, that the princess should sail in the same ship with Richard, a very strong and excellent ship was provided for her special use, and that of Joanna, who was to accompany her, and it was arranged that she should sail from the port just before the main body of the fleet were ready to commence the voyage. The ship in which the ladies and their suite were conveyed was placed under the command of a brave and faithful knight named Stephen of Turnham, and the two princesses were committed to his special charge. But although Richard's regard for the sacred season of Lent would not allow his celebrating the marriage, he made a grand celebration in honor of his betrothal to Berengaria before he sailed. At this celebration he instituted an order of 24 knights. These knights bound themselves in a fraternity with the king, and took a solemn oath that they would scale the walls of Acre when they reached the Holy Land. Acre was one of the strongest and most important fortresses in that country, and one which they were intending first to attack. Also, before he went away, Richard made King Tancred a farewell present of a very valuable antique sword, which had been found, he said, by his father in the tomb of a famous old English knight who had lived some centuries before. End of Chapter 9. Recording by Alana Jordan in St. Louis, Missouri. Chapter 10 of Richard the First. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alana Jordan. Richard the First by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 10. The Campaign in Cyprus. The time at length fully arrived for the departures of the English fleet from Sicily for the purpose of continuing the voyage to the Holy Land. Besides the delay which had been occasioned to Richard by circumstances connected with his marriage, he had waited also a short time for some store ships to arrive from England with ammunition and supplies. When the store ships at length came, the day for the sailing was immediately appointed. The tents were struck, the encampment abandoned, and the troops embarked on board the ships of the fleet. The Sicilians were all greatly excited as the sailing of the fleet drew nigh, with anticipations of the splendor of the spectacle. The harbor was filled with ships of every form and size, and the movements connected with the embarkation of the troops on board of them, the striking of the tents, the packing up of furniture and goods, the hurrying of men to and fro, the crowding at the landings, the rapid transit of boats back and forth between the ships and the shore, and all the other scenes and incidents usually attendant on the embarkation of a great army, occupied the attention of the people of the country, and filled them with excitement and pleasure. It is highly probable, too, that their pleasure was increased by the prospect that they were soon to be relieved from the presence of such troublesome and unmanageable visitors. Never was a finer spectacle witnessed than that which was displayed by the sailing of the fleet, when the day for the departure of it at length arrived. The squadron consisted of nearly 200 vessels in all. There were 13 great ships, corresponding to what are called ships of the line of modern times. Then there were over 50 galleys. These were constructed so as to be propelled either by oars or by sails. Of course, when the wind was favorable, the sails would be used, but in case of calms, or of adverse winds blowing off from the land when the vessels were entering port, or of currents drifting them into danger, then the oars could be brought into requisition. In addition to these ships and galleys, there were about 100 vessels used as transports for the conveyance of provisions, stores, tents, and tent equipage, ammunition of all kinds, including the frames of the military engines which Richard had caused to be constructed in Sicily, and all the other supplies required for the use of a great army. Besides these, there were a great many other small vessels, which were used as tenders, lighters, and for other purposes, making a total number of nearly 200. In the order of sailing, the transports followed the ships and galleys, which were more properly the ships of war, and which led the van, in order the better to meet any danger which might appear, and the more effectually to protect the convoy from it. Richard sailed at the head of his fleet in a splendid galley, which was appropriated to his special use. The name of it was the Sea Cutter. There was a huge lantern hoisted in the stern of Richard's galley, in order that the rest of the fleet could see and follow her in the night. The day of sailing was very fine, and the spectacle, witnessed by the Sicilians on shore, who watched the progress of it from every projecting point and headland, as it moved majestically out of the harbor, was extremely grand. For some time the voyage went on very prosperously, but at length the sky gradually became overcast, and the wind began to blow, and finally a great storm came on before the ships had time to seek any shelter. In those days there was no mariner's compass, and of course in a storm, when the sun and stars were concealed, there was nothing to be done but for the ship to grope her way through the haze and rain for any land which might be near. The violence of the wind and the raging of the sea was in this case so great that the fleet was soon dispersed, and the vessels were driven northward and eastward toward certain islands which lie in that part of the Mediterranean, off the coasts of Asia Minor. The three principal of these islands, as you will see by the opposite map, are Candia, Rhodes, and Cyprus, Cyprus lying farther toward the east. The ships came very near being wrecked on the coast of Crete, but they escaped and were driven onward over the sea until at length a large portion of them found refuge at Rhodes. Others were driven on toward Cyprus. Richard's galley was among those that found refuge at Rhodes, but unfortunately the one in which Berengaria and Joanna were born did not succeed in making a port there, but was swept onward by the gale, and in company with one or two others was driven to the mouth of the harbor of Limassol, which is the principal port of Cyprus and is situated on the south side of the island. The galley in which the queen and the princess were embarked, being probably of superior construction to the others and better manned, succeeded in weathering the point and getting round into the harbor, but two or three other galleys which were with them struck and were wrecked. One of these ships was a very important one. It contained the chancellor who bore Richard's great seal, besides a number of other knights and crusaders of high rank, and many valuable goods. The seal was an object of great value. Every king had his own seal, which was used to authenticate his public acts. The one which belonged to Richard is represented in the following engraving. As soon as the news of these wrecks spread into the island, the people came down in great numbers, and took possession of everything of value which was cast upon the shore as property forfeited to the king of the country. The name of this king was Isaac Comnenus. He claimed that all wrecks cast upon his shores were his property. That was the law of the land. It was, in fact, the law of a great many countries in those days, especially of such as had maritime coasts bordering on navigable waters that were specially exposed to storms. Thus, in seizing the wreck of Richard's vessels, King Isaac had the law on his side, and all those who, in their theory of government, hold it as a principle that law is the foundation of property, and that what makes the law makes right is right, must admit that he had justice on his side too. For my part, it seems clear that the right of property is anterior to all law, and independent of it. I think that the province of law is not to create property, but to protect it, and that it may, instead of protecting it, become the greatest violator of it. This law, providing for the confiscation of property cast in wrecks upon a shore, and its forfeiture to the sovereign of the territory, is one of the most striking instances of aggression made by law on the natural and indefeasible rights of man. In regard to the galley which contained the queens, that having escaped shipwreck, and having safely anchored in the harbor, the king had no protest for molesting it in any way. He learned by some means that Queen Joanna was on board the galley, so he sent 2 boats down with a messenger to inquire whether her Majesty would be pleased to land. Stephen of Turnham, the knight who had command of the Queen's galley, thought it not safe to go on shore, for by doing so Joanna and Berengaria would put themselves entirely in King Isaac's power. And though it was true that Isaac and the people of Cyprus, over whom he ruled, were Christians, yet they were of the Greek Church, while Richard and the English were Roman, and these two churches were almost as hostile to each other as the Christians and the Turks. Stephen, however, communicated the message from Isaac to Joanna, and asked her Majesty's pleasure thereupon. She sent back word to the messengers that she did not wish to land. She had only come into the harbor, she said, to see if she could learn any tidings of her brother. She had been separated from him by a great storm at sea, which had broken up and dispersed the fleet, and she wished to know whether anything had been seen of him, or any of his vessels, from the shores of that island. The messengers replied that they did not know anything about it, and so the boats returned back to the town. Soon after this, the company on board the galley saw some armed vessels coming down the harbor toward them. They were alarmed at this sight, and immediately got everything ready for setting off at a moment's notice to withdraw from the harbor. It turned out that the king himself was on board one of the galleys that was coming down, and this vessel was allowed to come near enough for the king to communicate with the people on board Joanna's galley. After some ordinary questions had been asked and answered, the king, observing that a lady of high rank was standing on the deck with Joanna, asked who it was. They answered it was the Princess of Navarre, who was going to be married to Richard. The reply which the king made to this intelligence, Stephen of Turnham thought he saw such indications of hostility that he deemed it most prudent to retire. So the anchor was raised, and the order was given to the oarsmen, who had already been stationed at their oars, to give way, and the oarsmen pulled vigorously at the oars. The galley was immediately taken out into the offing. The king of Cyprus did not pursue her, so she anchored there quietly, the storm having now nearly subsided. Stephen resolved to wait there for a time, hoping that in some way or other he might soon receive intelligence from Richard. Nor was he disappointed. Richard, whose galley, together with the principal portion of the fleet, had been driven farther to the eastward, had found refuge at Rhodes, and he set off, as soon as the storm abated, in pursuit of the missing vessels. He took with him a sufficient force to render to the vessels, if he should find them, such assistance or protection as might be necessary. At length he reached Cyprus, and, on entering the bay, there he beheld the galley of Joanna and Berengaria riding safely at anchor in the offing. The sea had not yet gone down, and the vessel was rolling and tossing on the waves in a fearful manner. Richard was greatly enraged at beholding this spectacle, for he at once inferred, by seeing the vessel in this uncomfortable situation outside the harbor, that some difficulty with the authorities had occurred which prevented her seeking refuge and protection within. Accordingly, as soon as he came near, he leaped into a boat, although burdened as he was with heavy armor of steel, which was a difficult and somewhat dangerous operation, and ordered himself to be rowed immediately on board. When he arrived, after the first greetings were over, he was informed by Stephen that 3 of the vessels of his fleet had been wrecked on the coast, that Isaac the king had seized them as his lawful prize, and that, at that very time, men that he had sent for this purpose were plundering the wrecks. Stephen also said that he had at first gone into the harbor with his galley, but that the indications of an unfriendly feeling on the part of the king were so decided that he dare not to stay, and that he had been compelled to come out into the offing. On hearing these things, Richard was greatly enraged. He sent a messenger on shore to the king to demand peremptorily that he should at once leave off plundering the wrecks of the English ships, and that he should deliver up to Richard again all the goods that had already been taken. To this demand Isaac replied that whatever goods the sea cast upon the shores of his island were his property according to the law of the land, and that he should take them without asking leave of anybody. When Richard heard this answer, he was rather pleased than displeased with it, for it gave him what he always wanted wherever he went, a pretext for quarreling. He said that the goods which Isaac obtained in that way he would find would cost him pretty dear, and he immediately prepared for war. In this transaction there is no question that the King of Cyprus, though wholly wrong, and guilty of a real and inexcusable violation of the rights of property, had yet the law on his side. It was one of those cases, of which innumerable examples have existed in all ages of the world, where an act which is virtually the robbing of one man by another is authorized by law, and is protected by legal sanctions. This rule, confiscating property wrecked, was the general law of Europe at this time, and Richard, of all men, might have considered himself estopped from objecting to it by the fact that it was the law in England as well as everywhere else. By the ancient common law of England, all wrecks of every kind became the property of the king. The severity of the rule had been slightly mitigated a few reigns before Richard's day by a statute which declared that if any living thing escaped from the wreck, even were it so much as a dog or a cat, that circumstance saved the property from confiscation, and preserved the claim of the owner to it. With this modification, the law stood in England until a very late period, that all goods thrown from wrecks upon the shores became the property of the crown, and it was not until comparatively quite a recent period that an English judge decided that such a principle, being contrary to justice and common sense, was not law, and now wrecked property is restored to whomsoever can prove himself to be the owner, on his paying for the expense and trouble of saving it. On receiving the demand which Richard sent him, the King of Cyprus, anticipating difficulty, drew up his galleys in order of battle across the harbor, and marched troops down to commanding positions on the shore, wherever he thought there might be any danger that Richard would attempt to land. Richard very soon brought up his forces and advanced to attack him. Isaac's troops retreated as Richard advanced. Finally they were driven back without much actual contest into the town, and Richard then brought his squadron up into harbor and landed. Isaac, seeing how much stronger Richard was than he, did not attempt any serious resistance, but retired to the citadel. From the citadel he sent out a flag of truce, demanding a parley. Richard granted the request, and an interview took place, but it led to no result. Richard found that Isaac was not yet absolutely subdued. He still asserted his rights, and complained of the gross wrong which Richard was perpetrating in invading his dominions, and seeking a quarrel with him without cause. But the effect was like that of the lamb attempting to resist or recriminate the wolf, which, far from bringing the aggressor to reason, only awakens more strongly his ferocity and rage. Richard turned toward his attendants, and uttering a profane exclamation, said that Isaac talked like a fool of Britain. It is mentioned as a remarkable circumstance by the historians that Richard spoke these words in English, and it is said that this was the only time in the course of his life that he ever used that language. It may seem very strange to the reader that an English king should not ordinarily use the English language, but, strictly speaking, Richard was not an English king. He was a Norman king. The whole dynasty to which he belonged were Norman French in all their relations. Normandy they regarded as the chief seat of their empire. There were their principal cities, there their most splendid palaces. There they lived and reigned, with occasional excursions for comparatively brief periods across the Channel. They considered England much as the present English sovereigns do Ireland, namely, as a conquered country, which had become a possession and a dependency upon the crown, but not in any sense the seat of empire, and they utterly despised the native inhabitants. In view of these facts, the wonder that Richard, the King of England, never spoke the English tongue at once disappears. The conference broke up, and both sides prepared for war. Isaac, finding that he was not strong enough to resist such a horde of invaders as Richard brought with him, withdrew from his capital and retired to a fortress among the mountains. Richard then easily took possession of the town. A moderate force had been left to protect it, but Richard, promising his troops plenty of booty when they should get into it, led the way, waving his battle-axe in the air. This battle-axe was a very famous weapon. It was one which Richard had caused to be made for himself before leaving England, and it was the wonder of the army on account of its size and weight. The object of a battle-axe was to break through the steel armor with which the knights and warriors of those days were accustomed to cover themselves, and which was proof against all ordinary blows. Now Richard was a man of prodigious personal strength, and, when fitting out his expedition in England, he caused an unusually heavy and large battle-axe to be made for himself, by way of showing his men what he could do in swinging a heavy weapon. The head of this axe, or hammer, as perhaps it might more properly have been called, weighed 20 pounds, and most marvelous stories were told of the prodigious force of the blow that Richard could strike with it. When it came down on the head of a steel-clad knight on his horse, it broke through everything, they said, and crushed the man and horse both to the ground. The assault on Limassol was successful. The people made but a feeble resistance. Indeed, they had no weapons which could possibly enable them to stand a moment against the Crusaders. They were half naked, and their arms were little better than clubs and stones. They were, in consequence, very easily driven off the ground, and Richard took possession of the city. He then immediately made a signal for Joanna's galley, which, during all this time, had remained at the mouth of the harbor, to advance. The galley accordingly came up, and Joanna and the princess were received by the whole army at the landing with loud acclamations. They were immediately conducted into the town, and there lodged splendidly in the best of Isaac's palaces. But the contest was not yet ended. The place to which Isaac had retreated was a city which he possessed in the interior of the island, called Nicosia. From this place he sent a messenger to Richard to propose another conference, with a view of attempting once more to agree upon some terms of peace. Richard agreed to this, and a place of meeting was appointed on a plain near Limassol, the port. King Isaac, accompanied by a suitable number of attendants, repaired to this place, and the conference was opened. Richard was mounted on a favorite Spanish charger, and was splendidly dressed in silk and gold. He assumed a very lofty bearing and demeanor toward his humbled enemy, and informed him in a very summary manner on what terms alone he was willing to make peace. "I will make peace with you," said Richard, "on condition that you hold your kingdom henceforth subject to me. You are to deliver up all the castles and strongholds to me, and do homage as your acknowledged sovereign. You are also to pay me an ample indemnity in gold for the damage you did to my wrecked galleys. I shall expect you, moreover, to join me in the Crusade. You must accompany me to the Holy Land with not less than 500 foot soldiers, 400 horsemen, and 100 full-armed knights. For security that you will faithfully fulfill these conditions, you must put the princess, your daughter, into my hands as a hostage. Then, in case your conduct, while in my service in the Holy Land, is in all respects perfectly satisfactory, I will restore your daughter, and also your castles, to you on my return." Isaac's daughter was a very beautiful young princess. She was extremely beloved by her father, and was highly honored by the people of the land as heir to the crown. These conditions were certainly very hard, but the poor king was in no condition to resist any demands that Richard might choose to make. With much distress and anguish of mind, he pretended to agree to these terms, though he secretly resolved that he could not and would not submit to them. Richard suspected his sincerity, and, in utter violation of all honorable laws and usages of war, he made him a prisoner, and set guards over him to watch him, until the stipulations should be carried into effect. Isaac contrived to escape from his keepers in the night, and putting himself at the head of such troops as he could obtain, prepared for war, with the determination to resist to the last extremity. Richard now resolved to proceed at once to take the necessary measures for the complete subjugation of the island. He organized a large body of land forces, and directed them to advance into the interior of the country, and put down all resistance. At the same time he placed himself at the head of his fleet, and sailing round the island, He took possession of all the towns and fortresses on the shore. He also seized every ship and every boat, large and small, that he could find, and thus entirely cut off from King Isaac all chance of escaping by sea. In the meantime, the unhappy monarch, with the few troops that still adhered to him, was driven from place to place, until at last he was completely hemmed in, and was compelled to fight or surrender. They fought. The result was what might have been expected. Richard was victorious. The capital, Limassol, fell into his hands, and the king and his daughter were taken prisoners. The princess was greatly terrified when she was brought into Richard's presence. She fell on her knees before him and cried, "My lord the king, have mercy upon me." Richard put forth his hand to lift her up, and then sent her to Berengaria. "I give her to you," said he, "for an attendant and companion." The king was almost heartbroken at having his daughter taken away from him. He threw himself at Richard's feet and begged him, with the most earnest entreaty, to restore him his child. Richard paid no heed to this request, but ordered Isaac to be taken away. Soon after this he sent him across the sea to Tripoli, in Syria, and there shut him up in the dungeon of a castle, a hopeless prisoner. The unhappy captive was secured in his dungeon by chains, but, in honor of his rank, the chains, by Richard's directions, were made of silver overlaid with gold. The poor king pined in this place of confinement for 4 years, and then died. As soon as Isaac had gone, and things had become somewhat settled, Richard found himself undisputed master of Cyprus, and he resolved to annex the island to his own dominions. "And now," said he to himself, "it will be a good time for me to be married." So, after making necessary arrangements for assembling his whole fleet again, and repairing the damages which had been sustained by the storm, he began to make preparations for the wedding. Berengaria made no objection to this. Indeed, the fright which she had suffered at sea in being separated from Richard, she had endured when, after the storm, she gazed in every direction all around the horizon, and could see no signs in any quarter of his ship, and when, consequently, she feared that he might be lost, made her extremely unwilling to be separated from him again. The marriage was celebrated with great pomp and splendor, and many feasts and entertainments and public parades and celebrations followed to commemorate the event. Among the other grand ceremonies was a coronation, a double coronation. Richard caused himself to be crowned King of Cyprus, and Berengaria Queen of England and Cyprus too. The dress in which Richard appeared on these occasions is minutely described. He wore a rose-colored satin tunic, which was fastened by a jeweled belt about his waist. Over this was a mantle of striped silver tissue, brocaded with silver half-moons. He wore an elegant and very costly sword, too. The blade was of Damascus steel, the hilt was of gold, and the scabbard was of silver, richly engraved in scales. On his head he wore a scarlet bonnet, brocaded in gold, with figures of animals. He bore in his hand what was called a truncheon, which was sort of a scepter, very splendidly covered and adorned. He had an elegant horse, a Spanish charger, and whenever he went this horse was led before him, with the bits and stirrups, and all the metallic mountings of the saddle and bridle in gold. The crupper was adorned with 2 golden lions, figured with their paws raised in the act of striking each other. Richard obtained another horse in Cyprus among the spoils that he acquired there, and which afterward became his favorite. His name was Fauvel, though in some of the old annals he is called Faunel. This horse acquired great fame by the strength and courage, and also the great sagacity, that he displayed in the various battles that he was engaged in with his master. Indeed, at last he became quite a historical character. Richard himself was a tall and well-formed man, and altogether a very fine-looking man, and in this costume, with his yellow curls and bright complexion, he appeared, they said, a perfect model of military and manly grace. There is a representation of Berengaria extant, which is supposed to show her as she appeared at this time. Her hair is parted in the middle in front, and hangs down in long tresses behind. It is covered with a veil, open on each side, like a Spanish mantilla. The veil is fastened to her head by a royal diadem, resplendent with gold and gems, and is surmounted with a fleur-de-lis, with so much foliage added to it as to give it the appearance of a double crown, in allusion to her being the Queen of both Cyprus and of England. The whole time occupied by these transactions in Cyprus was only about a month, and now, since everything had been finished to his satisfaction, Richard began to think once more of prosecuting his voyage. End of Chapter 10. Recording by Alana Jordan in St. Louis, Missouri.